Consider, if you will, the nature of power itself, not the crude force of armies or the weight of iron, but something far more subtle, the ability to fracture unity, to turn strength against itself, to make others do your work while believing it their own choice. In the ancient days of Middle-earth, before the sun and moon were kindled, this understanding separated mere conquerors from true architects of domination. Morgoth understood this perfectly. When he descended upon Valinor and shattered the two trees, plunging the world into darkness, he did not simply destroy beauty. He committed theft with surgical precision. The Silmarils, 3 gems crafted by Feanor that captured the light of the trees themselves, these he took not for their radiance alone, but for what their loss would accomplish. He understood that the elves' greatest strength lay in their unity, their shared purpose under the Valar. Take away something they held sacred, something that represented their highest achievement, and watch what happens. The result exceeded even his calculations. Feanor, perhaps the most brilliant mind the elves had ever produced, stood before his people and spoke words that would echo through 3 ages of the world. He swore an oath and convinced his 7 sons to swear with him to pursue anyone who kept a Silmaril from them, to wage war against friend or foe, Valar or demon, until the gems were recovered. It was a masterwork of manipulation. Morgoth never touched Feanor's mind directly. He simply created the conditions, planted the seeds, and let pride do the rest. The Noldor, the Deep Elves, chose rebellion. They abandoned the Undying Lands against the Council of the Valar and marched into Middle-earth seeking vengeance and glory in equal measure. Consider the strategic genius of this moment. Morgoth gained enemies, yes, but enemies divided from their greatest allies, cut off from divine guidance, operating on hostile ground where he held every advantage. The mightiest warriors of the elves spent thousands of years fighting him, and in doing so, they weakened themselves far more than they weakened him. This is the first lesson of the power game. The best victories are those where your enemy defeats themselves. But Morgoth's brilliance had limitations. He thought in terms of domination through fear, through overwhelming force, through the corruption of the world itself. He bred orcs and dragons, raised mountains, and poured his essence into the very substance of Middle-earth to corrupt it. His was the strategy of the hammer, and eventually the world broke him. The Valar returned, shattered his fortress of Angband, and cast him into the void beyond the circles of the world. His lieutenant learned from these mistakes. Sauron had served Morgoth not as a warrior but as a coordinator, a manipulator, a corrupter of the faithful. While Morgoth destroyed, Sauron observed. He watched how direct confrontation with the Valar led only to defeat. He studied how the Oath of Feanor continued to poison elven politics generation after generation, long after Morgoth's direct influence had ended. He learned that power embedded in systems, in desires, in the structures of thought itself, proved more durable than any fortress. When Morgoth fell, Sauron remained. He repented, briefly, before the Valar, or claimed to, but he refused to return to Valinor for judgment, and in that refusal lived the seed of everything that followed. He had learned too well. He had discovered that domination need not announce itself with fire and darkness. It could wear a fair face. The Second Age dawned. The elves who remained in Middle-earth began to heal the scars of war, to build new kingdoms, to create works of beauty that might rival even what had been lost. Men awakened and multiplied, learning craft and culture from their elder kindred. It was a time of recovery, of hope. Sauron saw opportunity. He came to the elves as Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, beautiful and wise. He offered to teach them the secrets of making, how to preserve the things they loved against the decay of time, how to create realms of beauty that would not fade. And the elves of Eregion, eager to recapture something of Valinor's splendor in Middle-earth, listened. This is where true strategic genius reveals itself, not in war, but in the patient cultivation of desire. Celebrimbor, greatest craftsman of the Second Age and descendant of Feanor himself, worked alongside Sauron for years. Together, they forged rings of power, objects of such sublime craft that they could preserve, enhance, and protect entire realms. These were not weapons, they were dreams made tangible, the dream of making Middle-earth a paradise, of halting entropy itself. Imagine standing in those workshops, watching silver and gold take forms that sang with power. The craft was real, the knowledge genuine. Sauron taught true secrets of making, shared actual wisdom. This is crucial to understand. The deception was not in what he taught, but in what he did with that knowledge afterward. The rings were distributed with careful political calculation. 7 rings went to the dwarf lords, proud rulers of mountain kingdoms rich in mineral wealth. 9 rings went to men, to kings and sorcerers who desired power above all else. 3 rings, the most powerful, the most beautiful, Celebrimbor crafted alone, without Sauron's direct hand, and these remained with the elves. And in secret, in the fires of Mount Doom in the heart of Mordor, Sauron forged the One Ring. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The words were not poetry. They were function, purpose, architecture made audible. He poured into that ring a vast portion of his own power, his will, his capacity for domination, his understanding of the patterns that controlled the other rings. Through it, he could perceive the thoughts of any who wore the subsidiary rings. Through it, he could control them absolutely. Consider the strategic calculation here. Sauron deliberately made himself vulnerable. He invested so much of his essence in the ring that losing it would diminish him catastrophically. Why accept such risk? Because he believed it eliminated all other risks. With the ring, he could command the wills of the most powerful rulers in Middle-earth. The 9 men fell quickly, their desire for power making them easy prey. They became the Nazgul, the Ringwraiths, neither living nor dead, extensions of Sauron's will wearing the shapes of their former selves. The 7 resisted direct control. Dwarves prove remarkably stubborn in matters of the mind, but the rings kindled in them an overwhelming greed that led to wars, dragon attacks, and eventual ruin. The 3, however, remained hidden. The moment Sauron first placed the One Ring upon his finger, every elf who bore one of the 3 knew instantly what had been done. They perceived the trap, understood the deception, and removed their rings. Celebrimbor, realizing the full scope of his unwitting collaboration, hid the 3. Vilya, mightiest of all, went to Gil-galad the High King, Narya the Ring of Fire, to Círdan the Shipwright, Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, to Galadriel in Lothlorien. Sauron's response was immediate and brutal. He marched on Eregion, destroyed it utterly, and captured Celebrimbor. The torments inflicted before death need not be detailed, but they served a strategic purpose, learning the location of the 3. Celebrimbor, to his eternal honor, revealed nothing. He died protecting the only significant power in Middle-earth that remained outside Sauron's control. This failure, this single gap in an otherwise perfect system of domination, would determine the shape of all wars to come. Because the 3 rings remained free, the elves retained the power to resist, to preserve realms against corruption, to maintain strongholds of beauty and wisdom. Rivendell, Lothlorien, the Grey Havens, these became more than refuges. They became living proof that another way existed, that power could be used for protection rather than domination. Sauron's strength grew tremendous. He conquered vast territories, commanded armies that blotted out the sun, but he could not achieve totality. And in warfare, particularly in wars of ideology and will, anything less than totality means eventual defeat. The Free Peoples recognized this. Elves and men, who had often stood apart or even opposed each other, forged the last alliance. Gil-galad, the Elven king, and Elendil, the Númenórean, led their combined hosts into Mordor itself. The war lasted years, countless thousands fell, but in the final battle, on the slopes of Mount Doom, both kings confronted Sauron directly. All three fell, but Sauron fell defeated. Isildur, son of Elendil, took up his father's broken sword and cut the ring from Sauron's hand. The Dark Lord's form dissolved, his armies collapsed into chaos. The age of his domination ended in a single moment of mortal courage, and then came the decision that would shape 3,000 years of history. Elrond and Círdan stood with Isildur at the cracks of doom, the very fires where the ring had been forged. They urged him to cast it into the flames, to destroy it forever. The path lay open, the war was won. One simple act would ensure Sauron could never return. Isildur refused. Understand, this was not simple greed. Isildur was not corrupt, not weak-willed. He was a hero, a legitimate warrior king who had earned his position through valor and sacrifice. He looked at the ring, this object of supreme craft, this repository of knowledge and power, and he reasoned, "My father fell fighting this evil. My people bled for this victory. This ring represents compensation, Wergild, a tool that might be studied and used for good." He called it his precious, but he meant it as one. Might speak of a hard-won inheritance. Therein lay the ring's true horror. It did not need to corrupt, obviously. It simply needed to make reasonable arguments seem more persuasive. Isildur took the ring north. He never reached his kingdom. Ambushed by orcs at the Gladden Fields, he tried to escape by using the ring's power of invisibility. But the ring betrayed him, slipping from his finger in the water. Isildur drowned in the river Anduin, struck by orc arrows, and the ring vanished into the stream bed. This single decision to preserve rather than destroy became a wound in history that never healed. The kingdoms Isildur and his brother Anarion had established continued. Arnor in the north and Gondor in the south became the shield kingdoms of men, buffer, states positioned to contain Mordor's influence even in Sauron's absence. They were founded on brilliant strategic principles. Arnor controlled the approaches to Rivendell and the northwest. Gondor held the Anduin Valley and the passes into Mordor itself. For a time, this arrangement succeeded. The Dunedain, the descendants of Númenor, who had remained faithful, proved resilient, long-lived, and possessed of wisdom beyond most mortals. They maintained watch, held fortresses, and remembered the wars of the past. Knowledge was deliberately dispersed among them, kept in multiple strongholds, so that no single catastrophe could erase what had been learned. This too was strategy defensive, patient, built for endurance rather than conquest. But all strategies carry within them the seeds of their eventual failure. The Dunedain kingdoms were designed to watch Mordor, to contain threats from the east and south. What they did not account for, what perhaps could not be accounted for, was the patient, immortal malice of a foe who had learned that direct assault leads only to defeat. Sauron had been struck down but not destroyed. His spirit remained, clinging to existence through the power invested in the ring. He could not yet take form, could not yet gather armies, but he could think, he could plan, he could wait. And waiting, he understood what his enemies did not, that time itself was a weapon. The elves were departing, sailing west to Valinor, slowly abandoning Middle-earth to mortal stewardship. Men multiplied and spread, but with each generation they forgot a little more of the First Age's lessons. The Dunedain, for all their nobility, could not maintain their bloodline's purity indefinitely when isolated among other populations. Strategic positions mattered only as long as someone understood why they mattered. 300 years after Sauron's defeat, the One Ring lay lost. The 9 rings remained with their enslaved bearers, the Nazgul dormant but not destroyed, waiting for their master's call. The 7 rings of the dwarves had been lost or reclaimed by Sauron through various means over the centuries. The 3 rings of the elves remained hidden, used to preserve sanctuaries of beauty, but their bearers understood a terrible truth. They were bound to the one. Should Sauron recover his ring, the power of the 3 would be revealed to him, and their realms would fall. Everything was connected. Every thread of power wove back to a single golden band lying in river mud, waiting. This is the essential architecture of the power game. Sauron had created a system where victory meant controlling a single point of failure, and defeat meant only waiting for the next opportunity. He had learned from Morgoth's mistakes. He had not poured his essence into the substance of the world itself, where it could be attacked directly. He had concentrated it, made it portable, created a tool that could be lost but also recovered. The strategic question became simple. Who would find it first? Who would have the wisdom to recognize what it was? And most critically, would they have the will to destroy it, knowing that such destruction meant forever surrendering the power it represented? These questions would not be answered for nearly 3,000 years, but they were asked in that moment at the cracks of doom, when Isildur turned away from the fire. Every war that followed, every death and sacrifice, every moment of courage or betrayal, traced back to that single choice. The power game had not ended. It had merely entered a new phase, one measured not in years or decades, but in ages of the world. And somewhere in the darkness beyond sight, beyond form, beyond the reach of mortal understanding, Sauron endured. He remembered. He planned. The game, as they say, was afoot, and it would be played across a canvas of centuries. There is a particular kind of death that comes not through sudden violence, but through gradual dissolution, the way a great tree, seemingly strong, reveals over decades that its heartwood has been rotting unseen. The kingdoms of the Dunedain died this way, not through conquest, though conquest came, not through plague or cataclysm, though these too played their parts. They died through division, through the subtle mathematics of fragmentation, where strength divides and divides again, until nothing remains but scattered remnants of former glory. Watch how it unfolds. Arnor, the northern kingdom, stood proud for nearly 1,000 years after Isildur's death. Its people maintained the watch, held the ancient knowledge, remembered the wars of the last alliance, but in the 861st year of the Third Age, King Eärendil died, and his 3 sons could not agree on succession. They divided the kingdom. Consider the logic that must have seemed sound at the time. 3 sons, 3 worthy heirs, 3 regions that could be governed separately. Arthedain in the northwest, Cardolan in the south, Rudar in the northeast. The bloodline would continue in all 3 realms. The knowledge would be preserved in triplicate. They remained allies, or so they told themselves. Brothers ruling, brother kingdoms, maintaining the watch together. But unity, once fractured, develops its own gravity toward further fracture. The 3 kingdoms squabbled over borders, over precedents, over which realm held the true line of succession. They built separate courts, developed separate interests, began to see themselves as distinct peoples rather than parts of a whole. Strategic coordination broke down. Intelligence was no longer shared freely. When threats emerged, each kingdom assessed them in terms of its own narrow interests rather than the North's collective security. Watching from the shadows, an ancient malice recognized opportunity. The Witch King of Angmar was the lord of the Nazgul, the chief of Sauron's 9 enslaved kings. He had waited, dormant, for centuries, while his master slowly rebuilt strength in secret. Now he received his orders: destroy the northern kingdom, not through open war that had failed before, through patient, calculated pressure applied to the weakest points of a fracturing structure. He established his realm of Angmar in the northern mountains, between Arnor's divided kingdoms and the lands beyond. His strategy displayed profound understanding of human political systems. He did not attack all three kingdoms simultaneously. He identified the weakest Rudar and infiltrated it, corrupted its leadership, eventually made it his puppet state entirely. Now Arnor faced not three allied kingdoms, but two against one, with the third controlled by their greatest enemy. Cardolan and Arthedain found themselves fighting on multiple fronts, unable to coordinate effectively, losing ground steadily. The Witch King's forces swept down in calculated raids, never committing to decisive battle where the Dunedain's superior skill might prevail, but constantly eroding their strength, forcing them to disperse their forces, to garrison more strongholds with fewer troops, to spread themselves thinner and thinner. This is the geometry of strategic collapse. Each loss forces you to defend more with less. Each defensive position you abandon opens new vulnerabilities. Each setback makes allies question whether alignment with you serves their interests. The Great Plague struck in the year 1636. It devastated all of Eriador, killing vast numbers in both human and hobbit populations. Cardolan, already weakened by years of war, never recovered. Its people scattered or died. The kingdom existed in name only, a ghost realm haunted by barrow wights in its ancient burial mounds. Arthedain stood alone. For 300 more years it endured, the last remnant of Arnor's glory. Smaller, weaker, but holding the line, its kings maintained the bloodline of Isildur, preserved the ancient knowledge, and kept faith with the old alliances. Elrond of Rivendell provided what aid he could. The rangers Dunedain, who had scattered into the wilderness, continued their watch over the lands they no longer ruled. But the mathematics were inexorable. Arthedain was a dwindling island in a rising sea of darkness. In 1974, the Witch King assembled his full strength and struck. His armies poured down from Angmar, overwhelming Arthedain's defences through simple numerical superiority. The capital of Fornost fell. King Arvedui fled north with the last of his people, seeking escape by sea. He drowned in the ice. The ships sent to rescue him were crushed in a winter storm, and with him died the last king of the northern line, or so it seemed. One small mercy remained. Arvedui had sent his sons south before the final battle. The royal line survived, though it would not wear a crown again for 1,000 years. Arnor was gone. Its cities were empty. Its fortresses were ruins. The North Kingdom, which had stood for over 3,000 years as the shield of the West, existed now only as a memory carried by scattered rangers who patrolled lands no longer theirs. And in the south, Gondor watched and learned all the wrong lessons. Gondor had seemed immune to Arnor's fate. It stood mightier, richer, more populous. It controlled the great river Anduin, held fortresses that could withstand any siege, maintained armies that had thrown back countless invasions from the east and south. While the north fell into ruin, Gondor's power had grown. But growth contains its own dangers. At its height, Gondor's realm stretched from the misty mountains to the borders of Harad, from the Iron Hills to the Bay of Belfallas. It maintained garrisons across thousands of square miles. It held mountain passes, river crossings, coastal fortifications. Its stewards, who had ruled since the last king, disappeared mysteriously 900 years after Arnor's fall, were capable administrators, wise strategians, faithful servants of their people. But consider the strategic vulnerability of overextension. Every fortress requires troops. Every garrison requires supply. Every new territory conquered demands more resources to hold than it generates in wealth. Gondor had spread itself across such vast distances that coordination became difficult, mutual support became delayed, and isolated strongholds became vulnerable to patient enemies. Sauron, returned now to Mordor in physical form though concealing his true identity, understood this perfectly. He had rebuilt his power slowly, carefully, learning from every past defeat. He did not march vast armies against Gondor's strongest points. He applied pressure to the periphery, forced Gondor to maintain garrison after garrison, bled their strength through 1,000 small conflicts that never rose to decisive battle. The strategic withdrawal began, subtly. A fortress here, deemed too expensive to maintain, a border post there, abandoned when troops were needed elsewhere. Each decision made tactical sense in isolation. Each retreat was orderly, professional, carried out with minimal loss. But strategies of withdrawal, once begun, developed their own momentum. The province of Ithilien was the first major loss. It lay east of the Anduin, directly across from Mordor, and had long been Gondor's forward defence, a beautiful, fertile land, whose people served as early warning against any stirring in the Black Land. But as Mordor's strength grew, Ithilien became impossible to hold. Its people were evacuated west across the river. Its farms went to ruin. Its forests grew wild and perilous. Gondor lost its buffer. Now Mordor's forces could mass on the Anduin's very banks. Then fell Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, Isildur's own city, built as the eastern guardian of Gondor. It stood high in the Mountains of Shadow, watching the passes into Mordor. For 2,000 years it had held, but in the year 2002, after a siege of 2 years, it fell to the Nazgul. This was not merely a tactical defeat. It was catastrophic strategic failure. The Nazgul claimed Minas Ithil for their own, renamed it Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery, and transformed it into a source of fear that radiated across the region. No longer did Gondor watch Mordor's borders. Now Mordor watched Gondor from a stronghold on high ground, looking down into their lands, launching raids at will. Worse still, Minas Morgul commanded the direct pass into Mordor, the very route that would need to be taken to reach Mount Doom should anyone ever seek to destroy the ring. That path was now guarded by the Witch King himself, who had destroyed Arnor and now bent his will toward Gondor's destruction. The strategic calculus shifted decisively. Gondor went from aggressor to defender, from expansion to survival. Osgiliath, the ancient capital, straddled the Anduin at its narrowest crossing. It had been the jewel of Gondor, a city of learning and beauty where the kingdom's 2 ruling brothers had once held court in twin towers on either bank. But the city had been damaged in the civil war of the Kinstrife, further devastated by the Great Plague, and now stood partially ruined, its population greatly reduced, yet it remained strategically vital. Who held Osgiliath controlled the crossing of the Anduin. Who controlled the crossing-controlled movement between eastern and western Gondor. In 2475, forces from Minas Morgul attacked Osgiliath in overwhelming strength. Gondor's garrison fought desperately, but weight of numbers told. The eastern half of the city fell, the great bridge was broken, the dome of the palace shattered, and the Palantir, the seeing stone that had allowed Gondor's rulers to communicate instantly across their realm, tumbled into the river and was lost. Gondor lost more than a city. It lost coordination, lost vision, lost the ability to perceive threats before they matured. The western half of Osgiliath remained in Gondor's hands, but it was a ruin now, barely garrisoned, no longer the proud capital but a frontier outpost in constant danger. The seat of government withdrew to Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, later renamed Minas Tirith, which became both capital and final fortress, the last major stronghold between Mordor and the Western lands. Observe how the strategic landscape had transformed. Where once Gondor projected power across vast territories, now it huddled behind walls, hoping to hold what remained. Where once it had depth layers of defense, territory that could be traded for time, now every loss brought the enemy closer to the heart, and presiding over this decline sat the stewards. They were, without exception, men of quality, capable, dedicated, bearing enormous responsibility with dignity, but they labored under a fundamental strategic error encoded in their very office. They ruled in the king's absence, maintaining the realm until his return. This meant they could not make the bold decisions kings might make. They could not risk the realm's survival on grand strategies that might fail. Their mandate was preservation, not transformation. They held the line, maintained the status quo, passed the burden to the next generation. This is a viable strategy only if the strategic situation remains static. Against an enemy who adapts, who evolves, who plays a game measured in centuries, preservation becomes a slow surrender. Consider Denethor, last of the ruling stewards, who held office as the War of the Ring approached. He was brilliant, perhaps the most capable leader Gondor had known in generations. He studied every scrap of ancient lore, knew Sauron's methods, understood the depth of the threat. He used the Palantir of Minas Tirith, risking his sanity to gain intelligence about enemy movements. But he would not claim the kingship, could not. His wisdom and his pride both forbade it. The line of the kings had not failed, merely wandered. To claim the throne would be usurpation, betrayal of his office's fundamental purpose. So he remained steward, powerful, knowledgeable, but ultimately limited by the definition of his role. And Sauron knew this, knew that Gondor would fight defensively, reactively, that it had leaders who would preserve but not dare greatly. He could plan accordingly. Yet Gondor did not stand alone, and its apparent weakness concealed a profound strength that Sauron consistently underestimated: the Rangers. When Arnor fell and its people scattered, they did not simply become refugees or fade into other populations. They became the Rangers of the North, the Dúnedain who maintained their identity, their knowledge, their purpose without kingdom or recognition. They patrolled thousands of square miles of wilderness, from the borders of the Shire to the Weather Hills, from the North Downs to the Lone Lands. They fought orcs in the darkness where no one saw. They tracked creatures out of Angmar. They ensured that hobbits and common folk could travel roads in relative safety, without ever knowing who protected them. They preserved the bloodline of Isildur from generation to generation, keeping careful record, maintaining the ancient knowledge, waiting for the day when a king might be needed again. This was guerrilla warfare elevated to strategic doctrine. No fortresses to besiege, no armies to destroy, no capital to capture, just scattered warriors who knew every valley and hidden path, who could vanish into wilderness and strike from unexpected angles. Sauron poured resources into the north for centuries and never succeeded in eliminating them. The Rangers represented something Sauron fundamentally could not grasp: loyalty not to power or reward, but to an idea, to a trust maintained across generations simply because it was right to maintain it. They fought without glory, without recognition, without reward, for century after century. They preserved strategic depth where none appeared to exist. In the south, Gondor maintained similar forces, the Rangers of Ithilien, who continued to operate in their occupied homeland, ambushing enemy forces, gathering intelligence, making Mordor pay in blood for every mile it held beyond the Anduin. They could not retake Ithilien, but they could make it perpetually contested, perpetually dangerous for the enemy. But these scattered resistances, however admirable, could not reverse the fundamental strategic situation. The Free Peoples were in retreat, had been in retreat for 3,000 years, and no reversal appeared possible. Sauron had time to corrupt, time to build, time to turn the Free Peoples against each other through fear and suspicion. His strategy of patience, learned through bitter defeat, was proving devastatingly effective. He did not need to conquer everything at once. He needed only to ensure that when the final confrontation came, his enemies would be too weakened, too divided, too despairing to resist effectively. Consider the genius of this approach. Every military loss suffered by the Free Peoples, reinforced the strategic message: you cannot win. Every fortress abandoned, every retreat ordered, every ally who fell away spoke the same truth. The tide of history flows against you. Despair is not merely an emotion, it is a strategic weapon that destroys the will to resist before the final battle even begins. Sauron wielded isolation as expertly as any blade. The elves withdrew to their protected realms, maintaining their beauty but engaging less and less with the outside world. The dwarves retreated into their mountains after their great cities fell to dragon fire and darkness. Men's kingdoms fractured and fought among themselves as often as they united against common threats. The Shire, that quiet land of hobbits, remained so thoroughly isolated that most of its inhabitants barely believed in the existence of the wider world beyond their borders. This was not accident. This was policy, Sauron's policy, executed through fear, through corruption, through the patient application of pressure that drove each people into isolation, where they felt safest, where they could pretend the gathering darkness might pass them by. And as the Third Age ground toward its conclusion, Sauron prepared his masterstroke. He rebuilt Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, even mightier than before. He gathered armies beyond counting orcs, trolls, corrupted men from the south and east. He made alliances with creatures of ancient malice. He prepared for a war that would finally shatter the last resistance. But there remained one element outside his vision, one factor his calculations could not account for, one strategic weakness in his otherwise perfect position: the ring. It had been lost for nearly 3,000 years, hidden in the darkness at the bottom of the Anduin where Isildur had fallen, lost to all knowledge, to all seeking. Sauron could feel that it still existed. He was bound to it too intimately for complete ignorance, but he could not locate it, could not call it. It was simply gone. And without it, he was diminished, powerful beyond measure, yes, commanding armies that dwarfed anything the Free Peoples could muster, but not complete, not invincible. The power he had invested in the ring, the control over other rings of power it provided, the absolute domination it promised, all of this remained tantalizingly out of reach. So his strategy became twofold: prepare for conventional conquest while simultaneously searching, always searching, for any whisper of the ring's location. He sent the Nazgûl abroad to hunt. He cultivated spies and informants. He tortured those who might know anything of the ring's fate. He understood that if he could recover the ring before launching his final war, victory would be absolute. The three rings of the elves would be revealed, their protected realms would fall, and no power in Middle-earth could stand against him. But if the Free Peoples somehow found the ring first, no. That path led to thoughts he refused to contemplate. Who among them would have the strength to resist it? The ring was his masterwork, his triumph. It called to power-hungry minds, promised the very thing they most desired. Any who found it would claim it, would try to use it, and in using it would reveal themselves to him. The strategic situation seemed stable. Gondor was contained. The scattered northern folk posed no real threat. The elves were departing. The dwarves were broken. His armies grew stronger while his enemies weakened. Time, that most patient weapon, remained on his side, or so he believed. But in the mathematics of strategy, there are elements that defy calculation. Chaos points where vast systems pivot on tiny, unpredictable factors. Random chance, disrupting centuries of careful planning. Somewhere in the world, unknown to anyone lost in darkness, hidden from all sight and seeking the One Ring waited. And waiting, it had its own nature, its own will. It wanted to be found. It wanted to return to its master. But sometimes, what we want and what we get follow different paths entirely. The strategic collapse of the Free Peoples appeared complete. Their strength was broken, their unity shattered, their hope dimming. Everything Sauron had learned from Morgoth's defeats, every adaptation he had made, every lesson burned into his immortal consciousness through millennia of struggle, all of it had brought him to this moment of approaching triumph. The stage was set, the pieces were in position, the final game was about to begin, and none of the players, not Sauron, not the wise, not the kings or stewards or warriors, none of them could imagine how a simple act of survival by an obscure creature in a dark cave would unravel 3,000 years of strategic planning and set in motion events that would determine the fate of the world. The ring was about to be found, and the finder would be the last person anyone would have predicted. There is a particular irony in strategic planning that military theorists rarely acknowledge. The more comprehensive your strategy, the more vulnerable you become to the utterly unexpected. Sauron had built a system of perfect control, calculated every contingency, anticipated every move his enemies might make. But his very brilliance trapped him. He could only imagine threats that thought as he thought, that valued what he valued, that pursued power as he pursued power. He could not imagine Gollum, or rather, he knew Gollum existed, had captured and tortured him centuries before, extracting every scrap of knowledge the creature possessed. But Gollum's strategic value, his role in the vast game, to Sauron he was nothing, a wretched thing that had found the ring by accident, possessed it for centuries in darkness, lost it again, a source of information, nothing more, disposable, irrelevant. This blindness would cost him everything, but we move too quickly. Let us begin where all great shifts in history begin, with a question no one thought to ask. Why did Sauron pour so much of his power into an object? Why create a vulnerability when he could have kept that power within himself, invulnerable, uncapturable? The answer reveals the fundamental calculation that haunts all wielders of power. Power, kept entirely within yourself, dies with you. Power, embedded in systems, in institutions, in objects, survives beyond any single lifetime. Sauron was immortal, yes, but immortality is not invulnerability. He had witnessed Morgoth's defeat, had seen how even the mightiest Vala could be cast down when the world itself rose against him. He needed his power to be separable from his form, to exist independently, so that even if his physical manifestation was destroyed, his will would endure. The ring solved this problem perfectly. It was durable beyond measure, nothing could harm it except the fires of its making. It was portable, small enough to hide, to carry, to move as needed. It contained his will in such concentrated form that it could dominate others, enforce his vision, create the system of control that would make him truly unkillable. But here emerges the terrible arithmetic of concentrated power. The more you centralize, the more you create a single point of failure. Distribute power widely, and you're harder to destroy but easier to dilute. Concentrate it in one place, and you're invincible until that one thing falls. Sauron made his choice. He gambled that the benefits outweighed the risks, that he could protect the ring through sheer military might and political control. For nearly 5,000 years, that gamble paid off. The ring existed, he knew where it was, and through it he commanded the wills of the mightiest rulers in Middle-earth. Then Isildur cut it from his hand. The strategic situation inverted in a single moment. Sauron's concentrated power became his concentrated vulnerability. Without the ring, he was diminished, still dangerous, still commanding vast knowledge and will, but no longer complete, no longer able to exercise the total dominance he had engineered so carefully, and the ring fell into the Anduin and vanished. For 2,500 years it lay at the bottom of the Gladden Fields, slowly sinking into silt, hidden from all seeking. This period represents perhaps the strangest strategic situation in Middle-earth's history. the ultimate weapon existing but unknown, unclaimed by any side, exerting no influence on the world's affairs despite being the linchpin of everything. This is what military strategists call a null zone, a space where potential power exists but cannot be actualized by anyone. The ring wanted to return to Sauron. It had will, purpose, a kind of malevolent semi-consciousness, but it could not act without an agent to find it, to carry it, to bring it within reach of forces that might return it to its master. It waited, patient as stone, malevolent as poison, until Déagol came fishing. The year was 2463 of the Third Age. Déagol was a Stoor hobbit, a riverfolk hobbit, one of the types that had not yet migrated to the Shire, still living along the Anduin's banks. He was fishing with his friend Smeagol, a day like countless others, probably thinking about dinner or the weather or whatever small concerns occupied his mind. His hook snagged on something in the riverbed. When he pulled it up, he held the One Ring. Consider this moment. Thousands of years of strategy, the fate of civilizations, the careful calculations of immortal powers, all hanging on a fishing accident. A random hobbit in an obscure corner of the world, with no knowledge of the ring's nature or significance, holding the hinge of history in his muddy hand. The ring recognized its moment. It acted with the only tool available to it, desire. Smeagol saw the ring, wanted it with sudden, overwhelming intensity that overrode friendship, loyalty, even self-preservation. It was his birthday, he told Déagol. The ring should be his as a gift. Déagol refused. So Smeagol strangled him and took it. This is how the ring operates, not through grand strategy or military force, but through the amplification of existing darkness in the heart. Smeagol was not evil before that moment. He was an ordinary person with ordinary flaws. But the ring found those flaws, possessiveness, jealousy, the small selfishness that exists in most people, and magnified them instantly into murder. Smeagol took the ring and fled. His people cast him out when they learned of his crime. He wandered, using the ring's power of invisibility to steal, to spy, to survive. The ring corrupted him year by year, stretching his life far beyond its natural span, twisting his body and mind. He became Gollum, named for the horrible swallowing sound he made in his throat, and eventually he crept into the misty mountains, seeking darkness and solitude. He found a cave, deep beneath the mountains, where no light penetrated. He lived with his precious, and there he might have remained until the world ended. But the ring had not finished its work. It had returned to circulation, yes, but Gollum took it somewhere even more remote than the Gladden Fields. From Sauron's perspective, when he finally learned of the ring's location centuries later, this was worse than if it had remained lost. At least lost, it might have been found by someone powerful, someone he could track or corrupt or confront. But in Gollum's possession, in those deep, dark places, it was as good as destroyed, unreachable, inert. This is the strange strategic paradox. The ring preserved Gollum's life, corrupted him utterly, but in doing so trapped itself in stasis for nearly 500 years. It had agency but not freedom, will but not the ability to act on that will, until Bilbo Baggins came walking through the dark. The year was 2941. Bilbo was a hobbit of the Shire, comfortable and respectable, who had been swept up in an adventure entirely against his will, accompanying a company of dwarves on a quest to reclaim their mountain kingdom from a dragon. Separated from his companions in the goblin tunnels of the misty mountains, lost and desperate, he was feeling his way through absolute darkness, when his hand touched something cold and metal on the ground. He put it in his pocket. Just simple survival instinct, grab anything that might be useful. He did not know what he had found. The ring did not reveal itself, did not seem significant, but it helped him find his way out. He put it on accidentally and discovered its power of invisibility, used it to escape the goblins and, critically, to slip past Gollum, who tried to murder him when he realized his precious was missing. Random chance. A fishing accident followed by a lucky find in darkness. 5,000 years of strategic planning disrupted by consecutive flukes. But consider what this meant strategically. The ring now resided with someone who lived in the Shire, that isolated, peaceful land so far removed from the machinations of power that most of Middle-earth's rulers barely knew it existed. Hobbits were beneath notice, small folk who farmed and ate and lived quiet lives. They had no kings, no armies, no ambitions beyond comfortable respectability. From Sauron's perspective, once he learned where the ring had gone, this was both gift and curse. A gift because hobbits were weak, unsophisticated, could easily be killed or captured once located. A curse because their very insignificance made them nearly impossible to find. They left no trail in the political landscape. They had no dealings with other nations. They were invisible not through magic, but through irrelevance. Bilbo brought the ring home to the Shire and simply kept it. Used it occasionally for small pranks, appearing and disappearing at parties, avoiding unwanted visitors. He wrote a book about his adventures but never mentioned finding the ring, told conflicting stories about how he'd acquired it, clearly felt some shame or unease about its origins, but could not bring himself to discard it. The ring was waiting again, patient, working on Bilbo as it had worked on Gollum. Though more slowly, hobbits proved surprisingly resistant to corruption, their small ambitions leaving the ring less to work with. But it whispered. It preserved Bilbo's life beyond its natural span. It made him feel possessive, secretive, uncomfortable in his own skin. And all the while, Sauron's power was growing. He returned to Mordor openly, began rebuilding his forces, preparing for the final war. He knew the ring still existed somewhere. He could feel it, distantly, like an ache in a phantom limb. But he could not locate it, could not call it, did not yet know who possessed it. This ignorance represented the most significant strategic vulnerability in his position. Without the ring, his victory remained uncertain. With it, he would be utterly unstoppable. Everything depended on finding it before his enemies even realized they should be looking. Enter Gandalf. Gandalf the Grey, one of the Istari wizards sent from the west to aid the Free Peoples against Sauron. He was not omniscient, not all-powerful. He was a guide, a catalyst, someone whose wisdom lay in recognizing patterns and connections that others missed. And he began to notice disturbing signs. Sauron was searching for something, interrogating prisoners with unusual intensity. The Nazgul were abroad again, hunting. The word Baggins had been heard in connection with Gollum's capture and interrogation, and Bilbo Baggins, that unassuming hobbit of the Shire, possessed a ring of power that granted invisibility, a ring whose origins he would not clearly explain. Gandalf spent decades investigating. This is crucial to understand: decades of patient intelligence gathering, cross-referencing ancient lore, tracking down obscure references, trying to determine whether this ring Bilbo possessed could possibly be the ring, the one that could doom or save the world. He could not simply ask Bilbo to give it up. If it was the one ring, it would resist being relinquished, would corrupt anyone who tried to take it by force. And if Gandalf was wrong, he would destroy a friendship and create panic over nothing. So he investigated, travelled to Gondor and spent months in their archives, consulted with Saruman, chief of his order, who dismissed his concerns, tracked down Gollum with Aragorn's help, and learned the creature's story. Piece by piece, the terrible truth assembled itself. The political implications, once the ring's nature was confirmed, were staggering. If Gondor learned that the ring existed, They would demand it as their right. Isildur's heir or not, they would claim it for their defense. If Saruman knew its location, his counsel could no longer be trusted. The power of that magnitude corrupts even the wise. If Sauron discovered it before it could be secured, he would send all his forces to claim it, and the Shire would burn. The decision to keep the ring's existence secret, known only to the very few who absolutely needed to know, was perhaps Gandalf's most critical strategic choice. Every additional person who learned of it multiplied the risk of exposure, the chance of corruption, the possibility of disaster. When Gandalf finally confirmed the truth, testing the ring in fire to see if the Elvish script would appear, the words that identified it beyond doubt, he found himself facing an impossible situation. The ultimate weapon existed. It was in the possession of hobbits in an undefended land, and the enemy was actively searching for it. Bilbo had to give up the ring. This itself proved nearly impossible, even after decades of gentle friendship. Even knowing intellectually that he should relinquish it, Bilbo could barely force himself to leave it behind when he departed the Shire. The ring fought him every step, made him feel like he was tearing out part of his own soul. He left it to Frodo, his nephew and heir. And now Frodo, who had never sought adventure or responsibility, who wanted nothing more than the quiet life of the Shire, found himself in possession of the object that could destroy or dominate the world. Gandalf's instruction was simple. Keep it secret. Keep it safe. Do not use it. Do not even speak of it. He left to consult with his allies, to determine what should be done. This is where conventional strategic thinking breaks down entirely. What do you do with a weapon you cannot use, dare not destroy, and must not let your enemy reclaim? Every option leads to catastrophe. Keep it hidden, and Sauron will eventually find it. He has time, resources, and the ring itself helps him by calling to him. Use it against him, and you become corrupted, become him. Try to destroy it, and you must somehow carry it into Mordor itself, into the heart of enemy territory, to the one place where it can be unmade. The Council of Elrond, convened to decide the ring's fate, represented perhaps the most consequential strategic meeting in Middle-earth's history. Representatives of all the free peoples gathered: elves, dwarves, men and hobbits. Each brought their own perspective, their own interests, their own fears. The debate revealed the fundamental problem. Elrond suggested hiding the ring again, deep and far away. But Gandalf countered, it will be found eventually, and meanwhile Sauron grows stronger. Boromir of Gondor argued for using the ring as a weapon against Sauron. Why surrender such power to the enemy? But Gandalf explained, anyone who uses it will become what they fight against, will become the new Dark Lord. The ring cannot be wielded for good, because its very nature is domination. Someone suggested giving it to Tom Bombadil, a mysterious being who seemed immune to the ring's power. But that path led nowhere. Tom would simply forget about it or misplace it. He existed outside the struggle, and the ring needed to be actively dealt with, not merely ignored. Saruman was suggested, but Gandalf revealed disturbing signs of the White Wizard's growing interest in power. The eagles were proposed, but flying directly to Mordor would be seen from miles away. The Nazgul would intercept them, and the mission would fail in full view of the enemy. Every conventional strategy failed. Every application of military thinking, every calculation of force and territory, every analysis of capability and advantage, all led to the same conclusion. There was no way to win, except one. Someone had to carry the ring to Mount Doom and cast it into the fires where it was made. This was the only way to destroy it, and destroying it was the only way to defeat Sauron permanently. Not diminish him, not drive him back, but end him forever, because so much of his essence resided in the ring that its destruction would destroy him. But carrying it there seemed impossible. Mordor was the most heavily defended territory in Middle-earth. Sauron's entire realm built around protecting Mount Doom from exactly this scenario. Armies could not fight their way through. No force could survive such an assault. The genius of the final strategy lay in its complete rejection of conventional power. Instead of an army, send a small group that might slip through unseen. Instead of warriors, send someone so insignificant that Sauron would never imagine them as a threat. Instead of using strength, use stealth, secrecy, and the enemy's own blindness. When Frodo volunteered to be the ring-bearer, the strategic calculus shifted entirely. Here was someone with no political ambitions, no desire for power, no military training that might make him think he could wield the ring successfully. A hobbit overlooked, underestimated, so far beneath Sauron's notice that he represented the fucked perfect blind spot. The formation of the Fellowship embodied this unconventional approach. 9 companions against 9 Nazgul symmetry as psychological warfare. But the composition mattered more than the number. Representatives of all free peoples, yes, but more importantly, warriors to protect the ring-bearer, not to wage war. A wizard to provide guidance and knowledge. And hobbits for hobbits, because Sam refused to be separated from Frodo, and Merry and Pippin inserted themselves through sheer determination. This was not a strike force. This was a delivery mechanism. Their success would be measured not in enemies killed or territory taken, but in miles travelled unseen, in survival against impossible odds, in simply getting one small person to one specific place. The strategic decision to go by secrecy rather than open war represented a calculated gamble. Sauron expected armies, expected his enemies to gather their forces and march against him, allowing him to crush them with superior numbers. Expected that if anyone possessed the ring, they would use it, allowing him to sense them and send all his power to reclaim it. He could not imagine someone choosing to destroy power rather than use it, could not conceive of someone walking willingly into his realm, not to conquer but to surrender the ultimate weapon. His entire strategic framework, built over thousands of years, optimized to counter threats he understood, left him blind to the one threat that actually came. This blindness was not stupidity. It was the inevitable result of his nature. Sauron valued power above all things, had pursued it for millennia, could not imagine existence without the drive to dominate. When he looked at the world, he saw it through that lens. He understood pride, ambition, fear, all the levers he could pull to control others. But humility, sacrifice, the willingness to give up power for the greater good, these things existed outside his comprehension. They were weaknesses, foolishness, characteristics of those who deserve to be dominated. So when the Fellowship set out from Rivendell carrying the ring toward Mordor with the intent to destroy it, they carried something more than a weapon. They carried the embodiment of a principle Sauron could not grasp, that strength sometimes lies in letting go, that victory sometimes comes through surrender, that the greatest power might be the willingness to have no power at all. The journey would test this principle against the weight of the world. Every mile would be purchased with suffering. Every decision would balance on the edge of disaster. The Fellowship would break, friends would fall, hope would fail again and again. But the strategy was sound. Not because it guaranteed success, nothing could guarantee that, but because it was the only strategy that Sauron's perfect, comprehensive, brilliant defense could not counter. He had prepared for everything except the possibility that someone might reject what he most desired. And in that gap between his understanding and the truth lay a thread of hope, thin as spider silk, fragile as morning frost, but real nonetheless. The ring was in play, the pieces were in motion, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the strategic momentum of history began, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Every great strategy contains within it the seeds of its own unravelling. The Fellowship departed from Rivendell with clear purpose, careful planning, and the blessing of the wise. 9 companions, bound by oath and necessity, carrying hope itself toward the fire that would either save or doom the world. But between strategy conceived in safety and strategy executed in the field lies a chasm filled with chance, with human frailty, with the 1,000 small decisions that cascade into consequences no one could predict. The first crisis came almost immediately. Which route to take? Stand for a moment at that crossroads. The Fellowship could go south through the Gap of Rohan, an open path, but one that brought them near Isengard, where Saruman dwelt, and Gandalf had grown suspicious of the White Wizard's intentions. They could attempt the pass of Caradhras, over the mountain, a direct route but treacherous in winter, or they could go under the mountain through Moria, the ancient dwarf kingdom, abandoned for centuries after something terrible awakened in its depths. This is the geometry of impossible choices. Every option carried catastrophic risk. Every path led through danger. Aragorn favoured the Gap of Rohan open ground, where they could see enemies coming, where they could move quickly. But Gandalf resisted, sensing that Saruman watched that route. Gimli advocated for Moria. His cousin Balin had led an expedition to reclaim it 30 years before, and surely they would find welcome there. But Gandalf knew the deep places of the world held horrors that made orcs seem trivial. They chose Caradhras, the mountain path. Perhaps it seemed the least of evils. The mountain rejected them. Whether through natural storm, or Sauron's malice, or Saruman's interference, the question was debated. Even at the time, a blizzard struck them on the slopes with murderous intensity. Snow piled in minutes to depths that buried the hobbits. Wind threatened to tear them from the mountainside. They could go neither forward nor back, trapped in a white void where every direction meant death. This is tactical failure through miscalculation of environmental factors. They had assessed the threats of enemies but underestimated the mountain itself. The Fellowship's first strategic decision ended in forced retreat. Hours lost, morale damaged, and options eliminated, which left only Moria. Gandalf stood before the doors of Durin, speaking words of opening in the old tongue, growing increasingly frustrated as the doors remained sealed. Meanwhile, something stirred in the water behind them, tentacles breaking the surface, groping toward the hobbits. They solved the riddle and rushed through just as the Watcher in the water attacked, collapsing the entrance behind them and eliminating any possibility of retreat. They were committed now, forward through Moria or not at all. The darkness of Moria deserves contemplation. The dwarves had delved too deep, seeking Mithril, and awakened something from the foundations of the earth, a Balrog, an ancient demon of fire and shadow, a remnant of Morgoth's first corruption of the world. It had slaughtered the dwarves and claimed Moria as its lair. Now the vast halls stood empty, monuments to pride and ambition, filled only with orc tribes scavenging in the ruins. Gandalf led them through in darkness, remembering paths from centuries before, navigating by memory and intuition through chambers that could swallow cities. For 3 days they walked in gloom, and the hobbits began to understand the true scale of the world beyond the Shire, that entire civilizations could rise and fall in darkness, that wonders beyond imagination could be built and lost, that the history they knew represented only a fragment of what had been. Then Pippin, curious and careless, knocked a skeleton into a well. The sound echoed. Drums answered from the deep. Orcs came pouring through the halls in response to the noise, and the Fellowship found themselves trapped in the chamber of Mazabul, fighting a desperate defense. They held barely and escaped into the corridors, running now, stealth abandoned, racing toward the bridge of Khazad-dûm and the eastern exit. But the Balrog had awakened. It came up from the abyss, fire and shadow given terrible form, its very presence making the air burn. The Fellowship ran, but Gandalf knew they could not outpace it. At the bridge, he turned to face it alone. This is the mathematics of sacrifice. One life measured against the mission's survival. Gandalf was the Fellowship's most powerful member, their guide, their source of wisdom and knowledge. Losing him seemed catastrophic. But if he did not hold the bridge, the Balrog would destroy them all, and the quest would end in those dark halls. He broke the bridge. The Balrog fell into darkness. And at the last moment, its whip caught Gandalf's ankle and dragged him down with it. The Fellowship emerged from Moria diminished, grief-stricken, leaderless. The strategic trade Gandalf's life for their survival had been made without consultation, without time for debate. It was simply necessary, and so it happened. This is war's harsh arithmetic. Sometimes the best strategic decision destroys something irreplaceable. But consider what they had gained, beyond mere survival. They had passed through Moria, a route Sauron did not expect and could not easily track. They had emerged on the eastern side of the Misty Mountains, closer to Mordor than they had been before, and though they did not know it then, Gandalf's sacrifice was not final. There are powers in Middle-earth that can recall the fallen when great need demands it. They fled to Lothlorien, that protected realm where Galadriel dwelt. Here they faced another strategic decision, whether to trust the elves with knowledge of their quest. Security through secrecy had been Gandalf's doctrine. The fewer who knew of the ring, the less chance of betrayal or corruption. But they needed rest, needed guidance, needed time to decide their next move without their guide. Aragorn made the call. They would trust Galadriel. It was the right decision, but not without cost. Galadriel tested them each in turn, offering visions, speaking to their deepest fears and desires. She showed Frodo her mirror, a basin of water that revealed possible futures, glimpses of what might be. He saw the Shire burning, saw his friends enslaved, saw outcomes too terrible to contemplate, and Frodo, in desperation, offered her the ring. Here is where strategy and morality intersect in complex ways. Frodo was offering Galadriel ultimate power, the ability to command armies, to reshape the world, to defeat Sauron through overwhelming force. From a pure strategic standpoint, giving the ring to someone powerful who could wield it effectively might seem logical. But Galadriel understood what Frodo could not yet fully grasp. The ring corrupts the powerful most of all. It amplifies existing desires. And what is the desire of the wise and mighty? To help, to protect, to order the world according to their vision of good. The ring would give them power to do exactly that, until helping became controlling, protecting became dominating, and good became simply whatever they willed it to be. She refused, passed the test, and in refusing, she demonstrated the principle that would ultimately determine the quest's outcome. Power must be rejected, not wielded. Victory through surrender. She gave them gifts instead, practical things. Lember's bread that could sustain them for days, cloaks that would hide them from unfriendly eyes, rope for Sam that would prove more valuable than anyone imagined. And to Frodo, the light of Eärendil's star, captured in a crystal phial that could shine in dark places when all other lights went out. The Fellowship departed Lothlorien and continued down the Anduin, approaching the moment when they would have to decide, east toward Mordor through the Dead Marshes and the Black Gate, or south to Minas Tirith and the war in Gondor. But they never got to make that decision as a group. Boromir had been struggling since Moria. He was a good man, a noble warrior, son of Gondor's steward and heir to its defense. He had watched his city decline his entire life, had seen his father age under the weight of impossible responsibility, had commanded armies in battles where victory meant merely surviving another day. He looked at the ring and saw salvation, a weapon that could save his people, drive back Sauron's forces, restore Gondor to its former strength. The ring whispered these reasonable thoughts to him, amplified them, made them seem not just logical but obvious, morally necessary even. Why destroy such power when it could be used for good? Why walk into certain death in Mordor when the ring could turn the tide of war in Gondor? At Amon Hen, while the others rested, Boromir confronted Frodo, tried to convince him. Then, when words failed, tried to take the ring by force. This is strategic thinking corrupted at its source. Boromir genuinely believed he was arguing for the right course. He could see clearly how to use the ring effectively, could visualize the tactical advantages it would provide, but he could not see or refuse to see that using it would make him into the very thing he fought against. Frodo fled, put on the ring and vanished, sat alone on the hilltop, invisible, wrestling with the decision. He could see Barad-dûr from there, feel the eye of Sauron searching, sense the ring's desire to reveal him. In that moment of crisis, he understood that the Fellowship had become a liability. The ring would corrupt them one by one, turn them against each other, destroy the quest from within. He had to go alone. Well, nearly alone. Sam figured out what Frodo intended, intercepted him at the shore, and refused to be left behind. "I made a promise, Mr. Frodo," he said. "A promise. Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee. And I don't mean to. This loyalty, simple and absolute, would prove more valuable than any weapon or strategy." While this happened, orcs attacked the rest of the Fellowship. Merry and Pippin were captured, dragged away by Uruk-hai, who had orders to find halflings and bring them to Isengard. Boromir died defending them, redemption found in sacrifice, his last act one of pure heroism untainted by the ring's influence. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli faced an impossible decision. The Fellowship had broken. Frodo and Sam had gone toward Mordor alone. Merry and Pippin were captives, being carried toward Saruman. They could not pursue both. Aragorn chose to follow the hobbits, to attempt their rescue. From a strategic standpoint, this might seem like the wrong decision, abandoning the ring-bearer to chase after two captured hobbits who were not essential to the quest. But Aragorn understood something deeper. They could not reach Frodo and Sam anyway. The two were already beyond help, committed to a path that could only be walked by those willing to bear the ring's burden. But Merry and Pippin could be saved, and leaving companions to slavery or death would poison whatever victory might be achieved. So they ran, tracked the Uruk-hai across Rohan, moving at a pace that would have killed normal men, surviving on determination and desperation. And they were not quite too late, though they arrived to find the Uruk-hai slaughtered by Rohirrim cavalry, the hobbits apparently dead in the battle. Except the hobbits had escaped during the fighting, fled into Fangorn Forest where they encountered Treebeard. Here is where strategy gives way to chance, or to what appears as chance but might be something deeper. Merry and Pippin stumbling into Treebeard. The oldest of the Ents, the shepherd of the trees, began a chain of events no one could have predicted. The Ents had not been included in any strategic calculations. They were assumed to be withdrawn from the world's affairs, uninterested in the wars of speaking peoples, too slow and deliberate to be relevant to fast-moving events. But Merry and Pippin told them about Saruman, about the trees being cut down to fuel the fires of Isengard, about the industrialization and destruction, and the Ents, who thought in terms of decades and centuries, suddenly decided to act in terms of hours. This is the entry of an unconventional force into a conventional conflict, something military planners categorize as unknown unknowns, factors you not only didn't account for but couldn't have imagined accounting for. Saruman had built his strategy around orc armies, around human mercenaries, around military power he could quantify and deploy. He had not imagined the forest itself would march against him. Meanwhile, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli encountered Gandalf returned from death, transformed into Gandalf the White, clothed now in the authority that had belonged to Saruman before his betrayal. Gandalf had no time for lengthy explanations. Helm's Deep was about to be attacked, he told them. Theoden King needed to be awakened from the poison Saruman had dripped in his ears through Grima Wormtongue. They had to move immediately. This is crisis management in real time. No opportunity for comprehensive planning. just response to immediate threats as they develop. Gandalf freed Théoden from Saruman's subtle corruption, restored him to himself, and prepared Rohan for the battle that was already marching toward them. 10,000 Uruk-hai against the few hundred defenders of Helm's Deep. The strategic mathematics were brutal. The fortress could be held, but only for a time, and no relief seemed possible. Théoden led his people to the deep anyway because staying scattered across the countryside meant being destroyed piecemeal. At least in the fortress they could make the enemy pay for every foot of ground. The battle tested every assumption about defense and siege warfare. Saruman had bred his Uruk-hai for combat stronger than normal orcs, able to fight in daylight, equipped with weapons specifically designed to breach Helm's Deep's walls. They carried explosives, used siege ladders, coordinated their assault with sophisticated tactics. But they underestimated the defenders' desperation and the fortress's design. Every gate, every wall, every passage had been built to maximize defensive advantage, and when the Uruk-hai breached the walls through explosive charges, they found themselves fighting in close quarters against men who had nothing left to lose. The siege would have succeeded anyway. Numbers tell eventually, except for 3 factors Saruman had not accounted for. First, Gandalf had gone to find Éomer and the scattered Rohirrim cavalry. He arrived at dawn with 2,000 riders, charging down the slopes into the Uruk-hai army from behind. The tactical surprise, combined with the sunrise blinding the enemy, turned the tide completely. Second, the Huorns came. Tree-like creatures shepherded by the Ents, they had marched through the night and now surrounded the fleeing Uruk-hai. Not a single orc escaped Helm's Deep. Saruman's army was annihilated utterly. Third, and perhaps most significant, Saruman had committed his entire military force to this one battle. He had assumed victory was certain, that Helm's Deep would fall, that Rohan would be destroyed, and he would then turn his strength against Gondor as Sauron's lieutenant, or perhaps as Sauron's rival, for Saruman coveted the ring for himself. While his army died at Helm's Deep, the Ents marched on Isengard. Treebeard had called an Entmoot, a gathering that lasted days, while the Ents debated in their slow, thorough way what should be done about Saruman. They decided at last, Saruman must be stopped, and when Ents decide to act, the consequences are geological. They tore down Isengard's walls stone by stone, broke the dams and flooded the underground furnaces, destroyed in hours what had taken Saruman decades to build. When Gandalf arrived after the victory at Helm's Deep, he found Merry and Pippin sitting in the ruins, eating and smoking, having witnessed the destruction of one of Middle-earth's great strongholds as casual spectators. Saruman himself was trapped in the Tower of Orthanc, unable to escape, his power broken. His strategic error had been catastrophic. He had concentrated his forces for a single decisive blow, and when that blow failed, he had nothing left. He had also underestimated the natural world, treating it as resource to be exploited, rather than force to be respected. But his defeat revealed something troubling. When Gandalf confronted him, Saruman showed them the Palantir, the Seeing Stone of Orthanc, one of the ancient communication devices of Númenor. He had been using it to spy across Middle-earth, and through it, Sauron had been corrupting him, showing him visions of power, slowly turning him from opponent to servant. The Palantiri represented a network vulnerability that no one had properly assessed. These stones allowed instantaneous communication and surveillance across vast distances, but they had been built when all users were allied. Now Sauron held the stone of Minas Ithil, and through it he could see whatever others saw through their stones. Using them meant revealing yourself to the enemy. This is information warfare, the strategic value of surveillance networks, and the catastrophic cost of compromised systems. Saruman's corruption had begun with his desire to understand the enemy better, to gather intelligence, but the intelligence-gathering tool itself became the vector of his defeat. Pippin, curious and foolish, stole a glance into the Palantir that night, saw visions, felt Sauron's attention briefly focus on him. The experience left him shaken, but it also provided unintended strategic benefit. Sauron briefly believed that Saruman held a hobbit, possibly the Ringbearer, captive in Orthanc. This misdirection bought time and redirected enemy attention away from the quest's true path. Gandalf rode immediately to Minas Tirith, taking Pippin with him, knowing that Sauron would strike at Gondor soon. The strategic situation was clarifying. Saruman was defeated, but Sauron remained stronger than ever. The quest of the ring would succeed or fail on its own. Frodo and Sam were beyond help now, somewhere in the dark lands approaching Mordor. What remained was to buy them time, to distract Sauron, to hold him back from focusing his full attention on defending Mount Doom. This meant war. Open war. The thing they had hoped to avoid. The direct confrontation where the Free Peoples were outnumbered and outmatched. But it was necessary now not to win, because winning that war was impossible, but to create enough chaos and threat that Sauron would focus on the armies before him, rather than the two small figures creeping through his realm's eastern marches. The Fellowship had broken, yes. The careful plans made in Rivendell had shattered against the reality of the quest. Gandalf had fallen and returned. Boromir had been corrupted and redeemed. Merry and Pippin had been captured, had escaped, and had inadvertently triggered events that destroyed Isengard. Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli had pursued them across Rohan and ended up at Helm's Deep. Frodo and Sam had gone on alone towards certain death. Every strategic decision had cascaded into unintended consequences. Every plan had been disrupted by chance, by enemy action, by internal conflict, and yet, somehow, they were still in the game. The ring remained hidden from Sauron. The Free Peoples were gathering for a final stand. Unexpected allies, Ents, Huorns, the army of the dead that Aragorn would soon summon, were entering the field. The Fellowship's breaking might have seemed like strategic failure, but it had distributed risk. Instead of one group that could be destroyed in a single catastrophe, now multiple threads of resistance operated independently, each creating problems Sauron had to address, each drawing his attention in different directions. This is resilience through decentralization, the same principle that had kept the Rangers alive for thousands of years. You cannot destroy what has no center, no single point of failure. The Fellowship had become not a unit but a network, connected by purpose rather than proximity, coordinated by shared goal rather than command structure. And in this breaking, this scattering, this apparent failure of original planning lay the seeds of something Sauron could not predict or counter: genuine chaos, human choice, the unpredictable element that makes all strategic certainty ultimately false. The game continued. The pieces had scattered across the board, and the true test of courage, of friendship, of the capacity to choose right action even when all tactical benefit had been stripped away, was only beginning. In darkness, in terror, in loneliness beyond imagining, two hobbits walked toward the fire. Behind them, armies gathered for battles they could not hope to win. All of it, the sacrifice, the suffering, the impossible choices, bought one thing only: time. Time for the smallest, weakest, most overlooked people in Middle-earth to reach the place where everything would be decided. The strategic mistakes had been made, the tactical errors logged, the perfect plans thoroughly destroyed, and somehow that was exactly what needed to happen. War reduces complexity to its essential elements: position, timing, and will. The War of the Ring came to its crisis point, with mathematical inevitability, not because anyone chose that moment, but because all prior decisions had narrowed possibility to a single convergence. Sauron launched his assault on Minas Tirith. The Free Peoples gathered what forces they could, and in the midst of armies numbering in the tens of thousands, The outcome would be determined by two hobbits Sauron did not know existed. But let us begin where the visible war began, with Saruman's defeat at Helm's Deep. That battle should have taught clear lessons about overconfidence and single-point commitment of forces. Saruman had built a perfect army for storming Helm's Deep, bred for the specific task, equipped with specialized weapons, provided with explosives designed to breach those particular walls. Every detail anticipated, every contingency planned for, except the contingencies that mattered. He did not account for Gandalf returning from death, did not imagine the Rohirrim cavalry arriving at precisely dawn, could not conceive that the forest itself might take sides in the war. His strategic miscalculation was assuming that because he had studied the enemy, he understood all possible threats. This is a failure mode that haunts every careful planner, the belief that comprehensive analysis equals complete knowledge. But the world always contains more variables than any model, more actors than any accounting, more possibilities than any imagination. Saruman fell because he thought the game had only the pieces he could see on the board. While the battle raged at Helm's Deep, a different kind of warfare unfolded at Isengard. The Ents were conducting what might be called ecological warfare, using the natural world's resources against an industrial target. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They did not maneuver for tactical advantage or seize strategic positions. They simply were nature, acting with nature's patient, unstoppable force. When water from the broken dams flooded Isengard's foundries, when roots tore through carefully laid foundations, when trees that had stood for centuries reclaimed land that had been stripped bare, this was warfare by restoration, destruction through healing, victory by returning corruption to its natural state. Saruman watched from his tower as everything he had built dissolved. His armies were gone, his fortress was ruins, his strategic position completely eliminated, and he could do nothing. The Ents were immune to the subtle corruptions he specialized in. You cannot manipulate entities that think in terms of centuries and care nothing for individual power. This illustrates a principle that would prove decisive in the larger war. Sauron and his servants had optimized their strategies against rational actors pursuing power. They understood ambition, fear, desire for control. They had studied human and elvish and dwarven psychology for millennia, but they had no framework for understanding motivations that existed outside the paradigm of domination. The Ents destroyed Isengard not for power or territory or revenge, but because Saruman had harmed the trees. This reason seemed absurd to those who thought strategically, but its very absurdity made it unstoppable. You cannot negotiate with or deter or redirect an enemy whose motivations you cannot comprehend. Now turn your attention south to Gondor, where the true storm was gathering. Minas Tirith stood as the last major fortress between Mordor and the Western Lands. Built into the side of Mount Mindolluin in 7 concentric levels, it was designed to be virtually impregnable, each level a separate fortress, each gate offset from the one below, so attackers had to fight their way up through multiple killing zones. At its summit stood the Tower of Guard and the White Tree, symbols of the kingship that had been vacant for nearly 1,000 years. Denethor ruled there as steward, and he was not blind to the strategic situation. He knew Sauron's strength, knew that Gondor's forces, even combined with Rohan's, could not match the armies gathering in Mordor, knew that every trend pointed toward inevitable defeat. But here Sauron had deployed a weapon subtler than armies: despair. Denethor possessed a palantir, kept secret even from his own counselors. Through it he had watched enemy forces massing, had seen the full scope of Sauron's might, had witnessed the steady erosion of Gondor's position. But the palantir was itself a weapon. Sauron allowed Denethor to see true things, terrible things, calculated to crush hope. What Denethor could not see through the stone was anything that might give comfort: the quest of the ring, the gathering of unexpected allies, the possibility of victory through paths other than military force. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. Sauron did not lie to Denethor, did not need to. Truth itself, carefully curated, became the instrument of paralysis. Denethor saw that Gondor could not win through strength of arms. He concluded, therefore, that Gondor could not win at all. The logic seemed unassailable. Strategic paralysis set in. Denethor made no preparations to coordinate with Rohan, sent no messengers to seek additional allies, implemented no unconventional strategies. He simply prepared for a defense he believed would inevitably fail, spending his remaining time studying ancient lore and gazing into the Palantir, watching doom approach. When Gandalf arrived at Minas Tirith with Pippin, he found a city preparing for siege with all the energy of condemned men awaiting execution. Technically proficient, tactically sound, strategically hopeless. The beacons were lit, the ancient signal fires built along the mountains between Gondor and Rohan, designed for exactly this emergency. One by one they blazed into life, carrying the call for aid across hundreds of miles faster than any messenger could ride. This was emergency communication infrastructure built in the Second Age and maintained for 3,000 years against the day it would be needed. Consider the strategic discipline required to maintain such systems across so many generations, keeping them ready for use even when centuries passed without need. It speaks to Gondor's institutional memory, their understanding that war with Mordor would eventually come again. Theoden King received the call in Rohan's capital of Edoras. He had just witnessed Isengard's destruction, had seen his own forces triumphant at Helm's Deep. The easy decision would be to remain in Rohan, to rebuild, to strengthen his own defences and let Gondor handle its own problems. But Theoden understood alliance politics. Gondor had stood against the darkness for 3,000 years, while Rohan prospered in relative peace. The debt was real, and more importantly, if Gondor fell, Rohan would be next. The strategic calculus was clear. Better to fight in Gondor with allies than fight in Rohan alone. He called the muster. 6,000 riders answered not the full strength of Rohan, but all that could be gathered in the time available. They rode east, the largest cavalry force assembled in centuries, racing toward a battle they might already be too late to effect. Meanwhile, Aragorn took a different path. He chose to travel the paths of the dead. This decision requires examination because it exemplifies high-risk strategic thinking. The paths of the dead led through the mountains beneath the Dwymorberg, haunted by the ghosts of men who had sworn oath to Isildur, and then broken that oath when he called them to war against Sauron. They had been cursed to remain as spirits until they fulfilled their oath to Isildur's heir. Aragorn was that heir. The last direct descendant of Isildur's line, though he had lived in obscurity as a ranger for most of his life. Now he claimed his heritage, not for power, but from necessity. He needed an army that could arrive in time, that could turn the tide of a battle that was already tilting toward disaster. The army of the dead was a strategic asset no one had considered, because no one believed it could be commanded. They were legend, terror, a cautionary tale about broken oaths. But Aragorn understood that curses, like all binding magic, have structure. The dead were bound to serve Isildur's heir. He was Isildur's heir. Therefore, logically, they were bound to serve him. The logic was sound. The risk was total. If he was wrong about his heritage, or if the dead rejected his claim, or if the curse had somehow expired, he would have wasted critical time on a path that led nowhere while Gondor burned. He went anyway, walked into darkness with Legolas and Gimli beside him, and the Dunedain rangers who had answered his summons. The dead rose before them, testing, questioning, and Aragorn commanded them, "Fulfill your oath, fight one last battle, and be released." They followed. This is the strategic, the value of legitimacy, not just claiming authority, but having the absolute right to command, recognized even by those who had been cursed for betraying that very authority. Aragorn could not have led conventional armies yet. He had no kingdom, no throne, no crown, but his bloodline gave him authority over forces that transcended conventional military hierarchies. While Aragorn gathered his ghost army, Sauron launched his assault on Minas Tirith. The siege began with psychological warfare. The Nazgûl flew overhead, shrieking, their very presence causing terror that broke lesser men's minds. Sauron's armies surrounded the city completely. Orcs, trolls, Easterlings, Southrons, siege towers, battering rams, catapults that hurled not stones but the severed heads of Gondor's soldiers captured in earlier skirmishes. The message was clear. Resistance is futile. Hope is gone. You are already dead. But Gandalf walked the walls, rallying the defenders, providing tactical guidance, preventing the complete collapse of morale. This was not military leadership. In a conventional sense, he held no official position in Gondor's hierarchy. But in crisis, legitimacy flows to competence, and Gandalf was the one person who seemed to have a plan beyond merely dying well. The battering ram Grond, named for Morgoth's ancient weapon, hammered at the Great Gate, forged in the fires of Mordor specifically to break that gate, empowered with dark enchantments, wielded by mountain trolls. The gate shattered. Sauron's forces poured through into the first level of the city, and the Witch King of Angmar rode through the broken gate, proclaiming that this was the end of Gondor's days, that no living man could stop him, a boast backed by prophecy recorded centuries before. Then the horns of Rohan sounded. 6,000 cavalry cresting the ridge as dawn broke, the Rohirrim arriving at the precise moment when their impact would be maximum. This was not accident. Theoden had timed his row, approached carefully, waiting for first light when his horses could see and the enemy would be blinded by the rising sun behind his riders. The charge of the Rohirrim at the Pelennor field stands as perhaps the finest example of cavalry tactics in Middle-earth's military history. They did not simply attack in a disorganized mass. They formed up by Eored's companies that trained together, knew each other's capabilities, could maintain formation at full gallop. They struck not at the strongest point but at the enemy's exposed flank, where forces besieging the gate had not expected attack from behind. The impact was devastating. Orcs broke and fled. Trolls were trampled. Siege equipment was smashed. In minutes, the Rohirrim carved through Sauron's army like a blade through cloth. But this was tactical success, not strategic victory. Sauron had committed only a fraction of his total forces to the initial assault. When the Rohirrim charge spent itself and the riders had to slow to reform, fresh enemy troops counterattacked. The Haradrim men of the south, riding great elephantine beasts called Mumakil, ploughed into the cavalry from the side. Theoden himself was thrown when his horse bolted in terror from a Mumak. He lay crushed beneath his mount, dying, having achieved his objective buying Gondor time but at the cost of his own life. The Witch King descended on him, ready to claim the king's death as capstone to Gondor's defeat. And Éowyn, Theoden's niece, who had disguised herself as a man to ride to war against her king's orders, stood over her uncle's body and defied the Nazgûl lord. "No living man am I," she told him. "You look upon a woman. This is prophecy fulfilled through technicality, yes. But it also represents the strategic value of the overlooked. Those whose capabilities are dismissed because they do not fit expected patterns. Éowyn had been left behind specifically because she was a woman, assumed to be unsuited for war. But she had trained in combat, possessed courage equal to any man, and now stood as the only thing between the Witch King and total victory. She killed him. With Merry's help, another overlooked hobbit, another person Sauron's calculations had not included. She drove her sword into the Witch King's face and destroyed him utterly. The Lord of the Nazgul, who had destroyed Arnor, who had commanded Sauron's forces for thousands of years, fell to two people neither side had bothered to include in their strategic planning. But even this victory could not turn the tide. The Witch King's death threw Sauron's forces into temporary confusion, but weight of numbers remained overwhelming. The Rohirrim were surrounded, cut off from the city, being ground down by sheer attrition. Gondor's forces were spent. The Pelennor fields would become their graveyard unless something changed. Then the black ships arrived. The Corsairs of Umbar had been called by Sauron to attack Gondor from the south, to trap the defenders between two armies and ensure complete destruction. Their ships sailed up the Anduin bearing black sails, and for a moment all hope died. This was the end. Until Aragorn's banner unfurled from the lead ship, the Star of Elendil, symbol of the ancient kingship, streaming in the wind, and from the holds poured not corsairs but the army of the dead, flowing across the battlefield like mist, killing everything that served Sauron and leaving the free peoples untouched. This was overwhelming force, at the critical moment, not a slow build-up or a prolonged campaign, but instant, absolute superiority, appearing exactly when and where it was needed. The psychological impact was as devastating as the military effect. Sauron's armies broke completely, fled back to Mordor, left the Pelennor fields carpeted with their dead. Aragorn had captured the Corsair fleet through the army of the dead, had sailed it up the Anduin to arrive at the battle's climax, had deployed an asset Sauron could not have predicted or countered. It was strategically perfect, and it was not enough. Because the battle was won, but the war was not. Sauron remained in Barad-dûr. His forces, while damaged, were far from destroyed. He could withdraw behind Mordor's walls, rebuild, and launch another assault in weeks or months. The Free Peoples had stopped one attack, but they could not sustain a defence indefinitely, which led to Aragorn's most audacious strategic decision: attack. March on the Black Gate, with 7,000 troops, all that could be mustered, and challenge Sauron directly. It was, by any conventional military analysis, suicide. The Morannon, the Black Gate of Mordor, was defended by fortifications designed to withstand armies 10 times that size. Even reaching it required marching across open ground, where Sauron could bring overwhelming force to bear. But Aragorn was not playing a conventional military game. He understood what Gandalf had grasped from the beginning. They were not trying to defeat Sauron through force. They were creating a diversion, drawing every ounce of Sauron's attention to the army at his doorstep so he would not perceive the two hobbits approaching Mount Doom from the other direction. This is the strategic paradox at the heart of the entire war, appearing to do the stupid, aggressive thing to conceal the smart, subtle thing. Sauron expected his enemies to act rationally, expected them to use any power they found, to build up their strength, to wage conventional war. An army marching to the Black Gate fit his expectations perfectly. They must have found the ring, must be trying to use it against him, must believe they could challenge him through military force augmented by the ring's power. He focused every censor, every agent, every Nazgul on that army, searching for the ring, seeking whoever carried it, and he found nothing because the ring was not there. This is strategic thinking at its most. Sophisticated, winning through making your enemy believe they understand your strategy when they do not. Aragorn revealed himself as Isildur's heir, announced his claim to Gondor's throne, marched an army to Mordor's gates, and every bit of it screamed, "I have found the ring, and I intend to use it." Sauron read the situation exactly as intended and deployed his forces accordingly. Meanwhile, in the absolute east of Mordor, unnoticed and unremarked, 2 exhausted hobbits climbed toward Mount Doom's summit. Sauron's strategic blindness was not stupidity. It was the inevitable result of his nature. He had built a system of perfect control, had spent millennia eliminating randomness, had created a military machine optimized to counter every threat he could imagine. But optimization for known threats creates vulnerability to unknown ones. He could not imagine someone destroying power rather than wielding it, could not conceive of courage divorced from ambition, could not understand that the greatest threat would come not from his mightiest enemies, but from the smallest, weakest, most overlooked people in Middle-earth. At the Black Gate, Sauron's forces poured forth in numbers that dwarfed the Free People's army. Trolls, orcs, massive siege beasts. The forces of the West formed up in a last desperate stand, knowing they would be overwhelmed in minutes, selling their lives for time they hoped someone, somewhere, was using well. The battle was brief and brutal. Perfect tactical coordination by both sides, the Free Peoples forming defensive squares, the orcs attempting to surround and crush them, neither side making significant mistakes. It was simply a matter of mathematics. More enemy troops arrived every moment. The defenders fell one by one. Gandalf stood on a rock above the fray, and his face showed no despair, because he knew what Sauron did not, that battles can be won by armies, but wars are decided by individuals making choices in moments no strategic planning can reach. In those moments, on the slopes of Mount Doom, the War of the Ring would be settled through means that made all the strategic brilliance and tactical virtuosity on display at the Black Gate ultimately irrelevant. The visible war was a distraction, brilliantly executed, necessary, successful in its objective, but distraction nonetheless. The true battle was being fought in a place so unlikely, by participants so insignificant, through a choice so contrary to all strategic logic, that even describing it requires abandoning the language of warfare and speaking instead of something that transcends calculation entirely. Victory would not come through force or cleverness or strategic superiority. It would come through the capacity to let go of power when every instinct screams to hold it. And that story, the real story, the one that mattered, was unfolding in darkness and fire, witnessed by no one, recorded by no historian, celebrated by no singer. Two hobbits against the accumulated malice of ages. That battle remained to be told. There are journeys that can be measured in miles and days, and there are journeys that can only be measured in the slow erosion of hope. Frodo and Sam's path to Mount Doom belonged to the second category. They walked through a landscape designed to crush the spirit, across terrain that resisted every step, carrying a burden that grew heavier with each passing hour, not through added weight, but through the intensification of its malevolent will. This was warfare of an entirely different kind, not armies maneuvering, not strategic positions contested, but two individuals fighting an internal battle while navigating through enemy territory so hostile that survival itself was a form of victory. When the fellowship broke at Amon Hen, Frodo believed he had to go alone. The ring was corrupting his companions, would eventually corrupt them all. Better to face the journey solitary than watch his friends turn against each other and against him, one by one. But Sam would not be left behind. "I made a promise," he said, and that promise proved more durable than any strategic calculation. Where Frodo carried the ring, Sam carried Frodo, sometimes literally, but always in the deeper sense of maintaining hope when Frodo's failed, providing strength when Frodo's ebbed, remembering why they walked toward fire when the ring's whispers made all reasons seem hollow. This is the strategic value of loyalty divorced from personal ambition. Sam wanted nothing from the quest except to keep his promise, to stay with his friend, to see the job done. The ring could not corrupt what it could not tempt, and Sam's desires were too simple, too focused on others rather than himself, for the ring to find purchase. They crossed from Emyn Muil into the Dead Marshes, following paths that wound between stagnant pools where lights flickered and the faces of long-dead warriors stared up from beneath the water. This was the site of an ancient battle from the last alliance, and the dead had never been properly buried, had never found rest. They remained, suspended in time, a memorial to the cost of war against Sauron. Walking through the marshes required navigating not just physical terrain, but psychological assault. The dead called to the living. The pools showed visions calculated to drain, will not lies exactly, but possibilities, paths not taken, futures that could never be. Frodo nearly fell in, drawn by a face in the water, and Sam pulled him back. This is where Gollum entered, as an unwitting, strategic asset. He had been following them since Moria, tracking the ring with the obsession of centuries. He attacked them one night, and Frodo, rather than killing him, showed mercy, bound him with elvish rope that burned his corrupted flesh, but offered him a choice: guide us to Mordor, and perhaps earn back some measure of trust, or be left tied for the orcs to find. Gollum chose guidance. Here unfolds one of the most complex strategic decisions in the entire quest: whether to trust an enemy who clearly, obviously, transparently intended betrayal at the first opportunity. By any rational calculation, Gollum was a liability. He was corrupted beyond redemption, obsessed with reclaiming the ring, incapable of loyalty to anything except his precious. But Frodo saw something others missed. Gollum had possessed the ring for 500 years and survived. He knew things about bearing that burden that no one else could teach. And somewhere deep within the twisted creature remained a fragment, tiny, fragile, nearly extinguished, of Smeagol, the hobbit he had been before the ring destroyed him. Frodo chose to trust that fragment. Not naively, he kept Gollum bound by oath, watched him constantly, knew betrayal would eventually come, but he trusted that the creature's knowledge of Mordor's paths and his desperate desire to serve the master who held the ring would keep him useful long enough to reach Mount Doom. This is strategic thinking that operates beyond pure calculation. Frodo understood that in a quest with no good options, you take the least terrible one and pray. Gollum was dangerous, untrustworthy, working his own agenda, but he was also the only guide available who knew the secret ways into Mordor. Sam hated it, distrusted Gollum absolutely, saw only the creature's malice and none of the possibility Frodo perceived. The tension between them became its own burden. Frodo, trying to find Gollum's remaining humanity, Sam certain no such thing existed, Gollum playing them against each other whenever possible. And yet this broken, dysfunctional trio made progress where an army would have failed, because they were beneath notice. 3 small figures moving through wilderness, appearing to be nothing more than lost travellers if noticed at all. The ring's power remained hidden as long as Frodo did not use it, and Gollum knew every hidden path, every cave, every route that avoided orc patrols and surveillance. He led them to the Black Gate, the Morannon, where they saw immediately that direct entry was impossible. Thousands of orcs, fortifications designed to channel attackers into killing zones, the Eye of Sauron scanning constantly for threats. Even if they could somehow fight their way through, which they could not, the attempt would alert every force in Mordor. Gollum offered an alternative, a secret path, a stair, a pass that the master did not watch so carefully. Cirith Ungol, the Spider's Pass. Sam's instinct screamed warning. Every fibre of his being knew this was the betrayal they had been waiting for, that Gollum was leading them into a trap. But Frodo saw no alternative. They could not go through the Black Gate. They could not wait. Their supplies were nearly exhausted, their strength failing, and delay meant discovery. Forward through danger or backward in defeat. There was no third option. So they climbed the stairs of Cirith Ungol, 3,000 steps carved into sheer cliff faces, ascending into the mountains of shadow. And at the top, in a tunnel that reeked of death and decay, they encountered Shelob. She was ancient beyond reckoning, a spawn of the great spider Ungoliant who had helped Morgoth destroy the 2 trees in the First Age. She had dwelt in these mountains for thousands of years, feeding on whatever wandered into her tunnels, orc, man, or beast. She cared not. Gollum had encountered her before, had made a bargain. He would bring her food, and she would let him pass. Now he offered Frodo to her. The ring would fall from the dead hobbit's hand, and Gollum could reclaim his precious without facing the burden-bearer in direct confrontation. This was the betrayal Sam had predicted, the trap he had warned against, and it should have been the end of the quest. Shelob was impossibly fast, impossibly strong, her venom paralytic and deadly. She struck Frodo down in the darkness, wrapped him in webbing, and prepared to feed. But Sam was there. Sam, who had never been a warrior, who had spent his life as a gardener tending flowers in the Shire, drew his sword and fought a creature out of nightmares. Not because he thought he could win, not because strategy or training suggested any hope of success, but because Frodo needed him. He had Sting Bilbo's blade that glowed when orcs were near. He had the phial of Galadriel, that crystal vessel holding the light of Erendil's star, and he had the one thing no weapon could provide, absolute refusal to abandon his friend. The light of the phial drove Shelob back, burning eyes that had known only darkness. Sam struck at her with Sting, wounding her, proving that even ancient malice could be hurt by simple courage and a sharp blade. Shelob fled into her tunnels, and Sam stood victorious, sobbing over what he believed was Frodo's corpse. Here is where the strategic situation approached total collapse. The ring-bearer appeared dead. The ring lay unguarded, and Sam faced an impossible choice. Take the ring and continue the quest alone, or abandon everything they had worked for. He took the ring, put it on its chain around his own neck, resolved to finish what Frodo had started. This is the moment where the quest should have failed utterly. Sam had taken the ring should have corrupted him, turned him, made him another Gollum. But Sam's desires remained stubbornly, magnificently small. The ring showed him visions of Sam the Mighty, turning all the world into a garden, making things grow through the power of command. But Sam recognized the absurdity. He was a gardener. He made things grow by working the soil with his own hands, not through domination. The ring found nothing to work with. Sam carried it not to use it, but solely to complete Frodo's task, and in that narrow, focused purpose lay immunity. Orcs came then, drawn by the commotion. Sam hid, listening, and heard them talking. Shelob's sting had paralyzed Frodo, not killed him. The orcs had taken the body into their watchtower, who would hold it for questioning. Frodo was alive, captured, and Sam had abandoned him. The realization struck like a physical blow. Sam had taken the ring based on false information, had assumed death when life remained, had made the wrong tactical decision. Now he had to reverse it, get into an orc fortress, find Frodo, rescue him, return the ring, all while surrounded by enemies. Impossible, completely impossible. Sam did it anyway. He infiltrated Cirith Ungol while orcs fought among themselves over Frodo's possessions, found Frodo stripped and beaten but alive, returned the ring, and this is crucial, without hesitation, without reluctance, simply gave back the burden as though it were the most natural thing in the world. This act, this simple relinquishment, demonstrated the principle that would ultimately determine the quest's outcome. The ring could be carried, could be borne for a time, but it had to be carried toward destruction, not possession. The moment you claimed it, intended to keep it, decided to use it that moment it owned you. Sam carried it to save Frodo, then gave it back, and in that giving lay proof that victory was possible. They escaped Cirith Ungol disguised as orcs, walking among patrols that paid them no mind because the idea of enemies infiltrating so deep into Mordor was unthinkable. They crossed the plateau of Gorgoroth, that wasteland of ash and slag, walking toward Mount Doom while armies marched west toward the Black Gate. Sauron's attention was completely focused on the forces challenging him at his gates. The eye scanned west, searching for the ring among Aragorn's army, certain that anyone who possessed such power would use it, would reveal themselves in using it. He had committed every resource to that confrontation, left the interior of Mordor guarded but not heavily watched. This is strategic blindness as fatal. Flaw. Sauron had created a defense optimized for attacks he expected, with every sensor pointed outward, every force positioned to counter conventional threats. An army marching on the Black Gate was conventional, expected, easily addressed. Two exhausted hobbits approaching from within his own realm, carrying the ring but not using it, heading toward Mount Doom rather than away from it. This was so far outside his strategic framework that even direct observation might not have triggered recognition. Frodo and Sam climbed Mount Doom's slopes. Every step was agony. The ring grew heavier as they approached its place of making, as though the mountain itself was pulling it back, resisting its destruction. Frodo could barely stand. Sam had to support him, sometimes carry him, giving his own failing strength to keep them moving. They reached the Sammath Now, the chambers of fire, where the ring had been forged. Stood at the cracks of doom where lava bubbled and heat made the air shimmer. This was the moment, the culmination. Throw the ring into the fire and end Sauron forever. And Frodo could not do it. He had carried the ring for months through impossible dangers, had resisted its temptations, had stayed true to his purpose. But here, at the final moment, the ring's full power focused on him. Everything it had been whispering throughout the journey crystallized into command. Mine. Precious. Keep it. Frodo put on the ring, claimed it as his own. In Barad-dûr, the eye turned from the Black Gate, suddenly, completely, understanding in an instant of horrible clarity what had happened. The ring was there, in Mount Doom, being claimed not destroyed. He called the Nazgûl, commanded them to fly at their utmost speed to the mountain, to retrieve the ring, to kill anyone near it. At the Black Gate, the Free People's army faced annihilation. The gates were opening, vast forces pouring out to crush them utterly, and in the Sammath Naur, the quest failed. Frodo had been corrupted at the last. Would not surrender the ring? Sam begged, pleaded, but could not make him throw it into the fire. Then Gollum arrived. He had been following them, tracking the ring with senses honed over centuries, had waited for this moment, leaped on Frodo, tried to take the ring, and in the struggle bit off Frodo's finger. Ring and finger together, Gollum stood holding his precious triumphant, having reclaimed what had been stolen from him decades before. He danced in joy, backing toward the edge of the precipice, holding the ring aloft in celebration, and lost his balance. Fell into the fire, still holding the ring, his last cry one of joy at finally having reclaimed his precious. The ring dissolved in the lava. Sauron's will, invested in it over thousands of years, destroyed in an instant. His form in Barad-dûr simply ceased to exist, his spirit diminished beyond recovery, scattered and broken. At the Black Gate, the Orc armies collapsed into chaos. The Nazgûl, flying at full speed toward Mount Doom, fell from the sky as their existence unravelled. The towers of Mordor crumbled. The quest succeeded, but not through the ring-bearer's courage at the final moment, not through strategic planning, not through any factor that could have been controlled or predicted. It succeeded through Gollum, through mercy shown months before at the edge of the Dead Marshes, through Frodo's decision to trust a corrupted creature's remaining fragment of humanity, through a chain of consequences so unlikely, so dependent on choices made for moral rather than strategic reasons that no planner could have designed it. This is the strategic paradox at the heart of everything. Victory came through failure. The ring-bearer failed to destroy the ring. But that failure was overcome by a previous act of mercy, by the presence of someone who should have been killed months before, by an accident of balance at a precipice edge. Sauron's strategic framework could not to account for this. He had optimized for rational actors pursuing power, had prepared for every foreseeable threat, but he could not imagine someone showing mercy to Gollum. The rational move was to kill such an obvious threat, could not conceive of victory through accidental redemption at the hands of the very creature you had spared. The eagles came, sent by Gandalf, and retrieved Frodo and Sam from the mountain slopes as it erupted around them, bore them away from destruction to safety and healing. They had succeeded, though at the last moment they had failed, had saved the world through choices made long before the final crisis, through mercy and trust, and the refusal to let strategic calculation override moral duty. Sam had carried Frodo when he could not walk, had given back the ring when he could have kept it, had fought Shelob when victory was impossible, had continued the quest, even believing his friend dead. Frodo had shown mercy to Gollum when killing him would have been easier, had trusted where trust seemed foolish, had carried the ring to its destruction, even though the weight of it eventually broke him. And Gollum, corrupted and wretched, had served the quest's purpose, through his very obsession, through 500 years of possession that taught him things no one else could know, through his knowledge of secret paths, through his presence at the final moment when his grasping need accidentally accomplished what Frodo could not deliberately choose. The victory did not belong to any single person. It emerged from the web of relationships, of choices made for reasons beyond tactical advantage, of the cumulative weight of many small acts of courage and kindness and stubborn refusal to surrender. This is why decentralized resistance proved more resilient than Sauron's centralized command. The Ents attacked Isengard for their own reasons. The army of the dead fought for honor. The Rohirrim charged because of loyalty. Éowyn stood over Theoden because of love. Sam carried Frodo because of friendship. Each acted from their own motivations, creating a coordination without central control, a strategy that emerged from individual choices rather than top-down planning. Sauron commanded through fear. His forces fought because they were compelled, because disobedience meant death, because he dominated their wills. When his will collapsed, so did everything built upon it. His structure had a single point of failure himself, embodied in the ring, and when that failed, everything failed instantly. The Free Peoples fought from choice, coordinated through shared values rather than fear. Their resistance had no center, no single point that could be destroyed to collapse the whole. Even with Gandalf fallen, even with Aragorn dead, even with every leader removed, the resistance would have continued because it came from within, from the collective choice to stand against darkness. This is the deepest strategic lesson of the War of the Ring. Power concentrated provides strength but creates vulnerability. Power distributed provides resilience but requires trust. Sauron chose concentration and lost everything in a single moment. The Free Peoples chose distribution and survived even total military defeat because their resistance was not invested in any single location or person or object, except the ring itself, which they sought to destroy rather than possess. Victory came not through might but through the willingness to sacrifice power itself, through choosing to destroy the ring rather than use it, through rejecting domination even when domination would have been easier. And in that rejection, in that choice to have no power rather than absolute power, lay the answer to every strategic calculation that had shaped 3 ages of the world. Sauron had been right about so much. Right about the utility of fear, the effectiveness of patient planning, the power of concentrated will, but he had been wrong about the most fundamental thing. He believed that strength equaled the capacity to dominate. The truth was subtler. Strength lay in the capacity to resist domination, including domination by one's own desire for power, in mercy instead of vengeance, in trust instead of suspicion, in the willingness to fail personally if that failure served a larger good. These things could not be quantified, could not be optimized, could not be controlled through strategy. They emerged from character, from culture, from the accumulated weight of small choices made over lifetimes by ordinary people who simply refused to let darkness win. The quest succeeded because two hobbits from the Shire carried hope to the fire. Everything else, all the battles, all the strategies, all the careful planning, was prologue to that simple truth. Victory in war is merely the beginning of the harder work, building peace. When Sauron fell and his towers crumbled, when the ring dissolved in Mount Doom's fires and the armies of Mordor collapsed into chaos, a profound question emerged from the smoke and ruin. What comes next? How do you rebuild when the enemy that defined your civilization for 3,000 years simply ceases to exist? How do you fill the vacuum left by the end of an age? The hobbits who returned to the Shire discovered that war's lessons travel home with those who fight them. Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin had left as provincial folk who barely believed in the wider world. They returned as veterans of the greatest conflict in Middle-earth's history, carrying scars both visible and hidden, knowing things about courage and sacrifice, and the weight of terrible choices that could not be explained to those who had stayed safe at home. And they found the Shire occupied. Saruman had survived the breaking of Isengard, diminished but not destroyed. Gandalf had cast him from the Order of Wizards, broken his staff, left him to wander. In his bitterness and spite, Saruman had turned his remaining malice on the Shire, that peaceful land whose very innocence seemed to mock his fallen grandeur. He called himself Sharky now, and he had corrupted Lotho Sackville Baggins to serve as his puppet, instituting rules and regulations that slowly strangled the Shire's traditional freedoms. Trees were cut down for no purpose but destruction. The mill that had ground grain for generations was torn down and replaced with a smoke-belching factory. Hobbits were forbidden to gather in groups, to travel freely, to live as they had for centuries. It was domination in miniature Saruman, trying to prove he could still rule something, even if only a land of farmers who had never asked for his attention. This was the final test of the strategic lessons learned during the war. The hobbits could have called for help. Aragorn would have sent troops. Gandalf would have intervened. The matter could have been handled by external powers. But that would have made the Shire dependent, would have established a pattern where freedom was granted from outside rather than reclaimed from within. Instead, the four travellers applied what they had learned about asymmetric warfare, about resistance against superior force, about organizing common people to stand against tyranny. Merry and Pippin had learned strategy from riding with Rohan's cavalry, from witnessing the coordination of large forces. Sam had learned from watching Aragorn lead, from Gandalf's example of supporting without controlling. Frodo brought the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes victory requires being willing to suffer personal cost, rather than using power to dominate. They organized the Shire's hobbits into companies, not as an army, but as a militia, neighbors defending neighbors, farmers protecting their own land. They did not seek to conquer but to liberate, not to dominate but to restore. When Saruman's ruffians, thugs he had hired from the south, tried to enforce his rules, they found themselves facing not helpless victims, but coordinated resistance. The Battle of Bywater was brief and decisive. The hobbits used terrain they knew intimately, coordinated through a network of communications built on existing relationships, fought with the confidence of people defending their homes. The ruffians were defeated with minimal casualties on either side, not through overwhelming force, but through superior organization and unshakable commitment. Saruman himself confronted them at Bag End, trying one last time to wield power through words, through manipulation, through the same techniques that had once swayed councils and corrupted the wise. But Frodo saw through him now, saw the pathetic shadow of something that had been great, reduced to petty tyranny, out of wounded pride, and Frodo offered mercy, told him to leave, to go find whatever peace remained to him, did not execute him, did not imprison him, simply released him from the Shire with the instruction to never return. Grima Wormtongue, who had served Saruman as he had once served Theoden, killed Saruman in that moment of final betrayal, a final act of violence born from years of abuse, and Hobbit's arrows killed Grima immediately after. The last shadows of the war died on the Shire's soil, and with them died the last remnant of Saruman's schemes. The scouring of the Shire demonstrated that war's lessons could be applied to peace, that military knowledge could serve defensive rather than aggressive purposes, that ordinary people educated about resistance could protect their freedom without becoming militarized. The hobbits had learned to fight, but they had also learned when to fight and why, and most importantly, they had learned that the goal was always to return to peace, not to perpetuate conflict. Sam applied his gardening skills to restoring what had been destroyed. He used the gift Galadriel had given him, a box of earth from Lothlorien, and a single seed of the Malorn trees that grew there. He spread the earth across the Shire, planted the seed in the party field, and watched as the land healed with supernatural speed. Trees grew, crops flourished, and the Shire became more beautiful than it had been before the war. This is strategic rebuilding, not returning to what was, but creating something better, incorporating the lessons learned while maintaining the values worth preserving. To the south, in Gondor, Aragorn faced a different kind of reconstruction. He was crowned King Elessar, the first king in Gondor in nearly 1,000 years, reuniting the divided kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor under a single throne. But coronation was the easy part. The hard work was building a government that could function, establishing legitimacy among people who had lived for generations without a king, creating alliances that would survive his lifetime. His strategy was integration rather than conquest. Where a lesser ruler might have imposed will through force, Aragorn built consensus through inclusion. He made peace with the Easterlings and Southrons who had fought for Sauron not out of weakness, but from understanding that these peoples had been corrupted and dominated, not innately evil. Given choice, given fair treatment, many would become allies rather than perpetual enemies. He married Arwen, Elrond's daughter, and through that marriage created symbolic unity between the elven and human lines. This was political strategy of the deepest kind, not cynical manipulation, but genuine alliance, expressing shared values and commitment to Middle-earth's future. Arwen chose mortality to stay with Aragorn, surrendering her immortal life for love. The choice echoed Luthien's decision in the First Age, and in that echo lay legitimacy older and deeper than any crown. Aragorn released territories that Gondor had claimed but could not justly hold, made treaties based on mutual benefit rather than domination, established trade relationships that enriched all parties. This was strategic vision playing out across decades, building a peace that would last not because it was enforced through fear, but because it served everyone's interests. He also made the calculated decision to let the elves depart rather than attempting to keep them in Middle-earth. This might seem like weakening his realm. The elves possessed knowledge, power, and wisdom beyond mortal capacity. But Aragorn understood that the Fourth Age was humanity's age, that mortals needed to learn to manage their own affairs without relying on immortal guidance. Gandalf left as well, sailing west with the Ring-Bearers. His work was complete. He had been sent to Middle-earth specifically to oppose Sauron, and with Sauron's defeat, his purpose was fulfilled. More importantly, his continued presence would have created dependency. The Free Peoples needed to discover that they could solve problems, build civilizations, create beauty without divine intervention, managing the details. This is the wisdom of knowing when to remove yourself from systems you helped create. Power that cannot let go eventually becomes oppression, no matter how benevolent its intent. Gandalf understood that his departure was his final gift, forcing mortals to trust themselves. The Fourth Age dawned with strategic realignment across all of Middle-earth. The elves sailed to Valinor, taking with them the Three Rings and the ancient magic they represented. The dwarves retreated to their mountains, rebuilding kingdoms that had been lost to dragonfire and darkness. Men spread and multiplied, taking stewardship of lands that had been wilderness or waste. Aragorn's long-term strategic vision was remarkable in its subtlety. He did not try to create an empire, did not attempt to impose Gondor's culture on other peoples. Instead, he built a network of allied kingdoms, each maintaining its own identity and governance, connected through mutual interest and shared memory of the war. He established the Rangers as official guardians, not a military force in the traditional sense, but scouts and protectors who maintained watch over wilderness areas, who prevented the resurgence of evil in empty places, who ensured that the darkness could not gather again unnoticed. This was preventive strategy, maintaining security through awareness rather than through force. The reunited kingdom of Arnor and Gondor was designed with redundancy. Multiple centers of power, distributed authority, systems that could survive the loss of any single component. Aragorn had learned from Sauron's defeat. Centralized power concentrated in one location or person creates vulnerability. Distribution creates resilience. But perhaps the most important strategic doctrine established in the Fourth Age was about the relationship between power and sacrifice. The war had been won not by those who sought power, but by those willing to sacrifice it. This principle was encoded into the New Order's foundation. Aragorn could have claimed the ring when it was found. He had the bloodline, the strength of will, the strategic position to make use of it. He refused because he understood that using it would corrupt him, would make him into another Dark Lord regardless of his intentions. Galadriel had been offered the ring and refused for the same reason, understanding that even the wise, perhaps especially the wise, were vulnerable to the corruption of absolute power. Gandalf had never sought to claim the ring, had worked entirely through counsel and support rather than command. And ultimately, Frodo had carried the ring to its destruction, walking into fire to end it rather than using its power to reshape the world according to his vision. This pattern, power rejected rather than wielded, victory through surrender rather than domination, became the philosophical foundation of the New Age. The Free Peoples had learned that might does not make right, that the willingness to use power is not the same as the wisdom to wield it well, that sometimes the greatest strength lies in letting go. Consider how radical this principle was in strategic terms. Every military doctrine, every theory of power, every system of governance, assumes that strength should be used to achieve objectives. But the War of the Ring taught a different lesson, that strength must be tempered by the willingness to not use it, that power unchecked becomes tyranny, regardless of intent, that victory means destroying the means of domination rather than claiming them. The Fourth Age embodied this wisdom. Aragorn ruled not as absolute monarch, but as first among allies. The Rangers protected not through force but through vigilance. The kingdoms coordinated not through command but through cooperation. Power was distributed, checked, balanced by the knowledge that concentration leads to corruption. This created a fundamentally different strategic environment. Where Sauron's defeat had left a vacuum, the Free Peoples filled it not with another would-be dominator, but with a network of relationships, with institutions designed for resilience rather than control, with cultural memory of how victory had been achieved and why. The memory mattered enormously. Stories were told, songs were sung, records were kept. The next generation learned not just that Sauron had been defeated, but how through courage in small people, through mercy when vengeance seemed justified, through the willingness to sacrifice everything including life itself, for the possibility that darkness might be ended, these stories served strategic purpose. They inoculated against the desire for domination. created cultural antibodies against the argument that power should be concentrated for efficiency, preserved the knowledge that war's goal is always to return to peace rather than to perpetuate conflict. Frodo never fully recovered from his wounds, physical, psychological, and spiritual. The ring had marked him too deeply, and Middle-earth held too many reminders of what he had endured. Eventually, he sailed west with Gandalf and the elves, seeking healing in the Undying Lands. This was not defeat. It was recognition that some sacrifices leave scars that cannot be healed in the place where they were earned. Sam remained, living a long life in the Shire, raising children, serving multiple terms as mayor, planting trees and gardens across the land he had helped save. He represented the principle of returning to ordinary life after extraordinary service, of finding meaning in the simple act of making things grow, of understanding that peace is built through 10,000 small acts of care and attention. Merry and Pippin became leaders in their respective families, maintaining contact with the wider world, ensuring that the Shire never again became so isolated that it forgot the lessons of the war. They represented the balance between isolation and engagement, between preserving local culture and participating in larger events. The strategic lessons of the War of the Ring crystallized into doctrine. Cooperation beats domination. Resilience comes from distribution, not concentration. Power must be balanced by the willingness to surrender it, and victory's goal is always the return to peace, where ordinary people can live ordinary lives. These principles sound simple, almost naive, but they were purchased through immense sacrifice, validated through successful resistance against the most sophisticated strategic mind in Middle-earth's history, and proven through the stable peace that followed. Sauron had been brilliant. His strategies were sound, his plans comprehensive, his execution nearly flawless. He failed not because he was stupid or careless, but because his fundamental assumptions about power and human nature were wrong. He believed that people acted primarily from fear and desire for domination, that the strongest will would inevitably triumph, that power was its own justification. The Free Peoples proved him wrong by demonstrating that people could act from love, from duty, from simple, stubborn refusal to accept domination, that the weakest will, supported by friendship and purpose, could endure where the strongest broke, that power without moral foundation was ultimately hollow, could be resisted and finally destroyed by those willing to sacrifice everything to end it. This is the final analysis. Victory came not through superior strategy, but through superior values. Not through better tactics, but through better understanding of what made resistance possible, what made sacrifice meaningful, what made peace worth achieving. The War of the Ring was won on the slopes of Mount Doom by two hobbits who had every reason to give up, supported by friends who had every reason to despair, fighting for a world that barely knew they existed. Everything else, all the armies, all the battles, all the careful planning by both sides was context for that central truth. And in the peace that followed, in the Fourth Age that dawned over Middle-earth, that truth became the foundation of a new order, not perfect, not invulnerable, not eternal, but human in scale, built on cooperation rather than domination, resilient through distribution rather than fragile through concentration, and conscious always of the price that had been paid for freedom. The strategic realignment was complete. The Free Peoples had learned to manage their own fate, to resist darkness not through superior power but through superior purpose, to build a peace that honored those who had sacrificed to achieve it. The game was over, the pieces were put away, and life ordinary, precious, hard-won life continued. This was the victory that mattered, not the defeat of Sauron, significant though that was, but the world that came after, the peace that was built, the knowledge that darkness could be resisted and defeated if people were willing to stand together and surrender the very power they might have used to dominate. Middle-earth turned, the Fourth Age unfolded, and somewhere in the Shire, Sam Gamgee planted gardens and raised children and told stories about the friend who had saved the world and the long road they had walked together. The strategic lesson was simple in the end. You win not by becoming like your enemy, not by matching their strength with your own domination, but by refusing to play that game entirely, by choosing cooperation over control, mercy over vengeance, sacrifice over power. This is how the War of the Ring was won. This is how peace was built. This is how an age ended and another began. Not through might, but through the willingness to have no might at all. Not through domination, but through the courage to reject domination, even when it was offered freely. The ring was destroyed. The power was ended. And in that ending, everything truly began.